This week's episode was sponsored by Alie over on Patreon. So thank you so much, Alie. I appreciate your support more than you know. And for your patronage, you're going to get your own... It's tied up here, one second. Your own... God damn it, why is it still tied up? Your own custom patch added to the old tapestry back there. So why don't I do that now? Yeah! I guess my smoke powers are canon now. So, yep, there it is. It's kind of hard to see because, well, I'm really bad at framing shots. But thank you, Alie. You're right there next to Michael Bertrand. If you would like to join them, then head over to my Patreon and follow the directions, I guess. I don't know. Also, just a little reminder, but last week I accidentally... made a patch with the wrong initials. Michael Bertrand was our sponsor, and he has initials MDB. I made a patch that says MJB, and so now I'm looking for someone to donate to me in order so I can use this patch. Although, as someone pointed out in the comments, MJB are Mary J. Blige's initials, and so I have decided that I will only take a donation from Mary J. Blige. So if anyone knows Mary J. Blige, let her know that this patch is waiting for her if she wants to sponsor an episode of a YouTube show. I think she might want to do that, but hopefully one day. But yeah, other than that, let's start the episode. I don't know why I do these unscripted. I'm terrible off the cuff, but I don't feel like writing more than I have to. Hopefully the people who donate to me don't regret their decision because of how terrible I am at thanking them. But seriously, thank you. I really do appreciate it. Let's just start the episode. Yeah! Greetings, Knitwits, and welcome to Knitting Time with Willie. I'm your host, Willie Muse, joined as always by my co-host, Knitcolis. And today I'm going to try and keep things brief up top because I feel like I can sometimes ramble so long in my intros that it turns off new viewers who just want me to get to the topic that they clicked in for. And I super don't want to alienate anyone because today is all about growing my audience and increasing the size of the knit nation. The knittion. Continent. I don't know, I'm an idiot. As you can tell by the fact that I'm wearing my skeleton sweater, it's time for yet another episode of my long-running series, Hey, this thing is popular. Maybe if I make a video about it, the algorithm will promote me and I will become popular too. I know I said last time that I was going to come up with a new thing to call it, but well, as you can tell from that whole continent situation from a few seconds ago, naming things isn't really my strong suit, so I feel like I'm kind of stuck with the long one at this point. If you're new to this series, and odds are you are given that it's currently only one video long, then why don't I take a second to let you guys know what it's all about. Although truth told, I feel like that title is already pretty descriptive. Like I feel like you already know everything you need to know from it. It's long, but it's informative, and honestly, that's why it has staying power. In any case, like everyone on this garbage site, I am currently trying to grow my channel, and in order to do that, I've decided to dedicate episodes to topics that the algorithm seems to favor in order to try and reach a wider audience. It's not exactly the most clever plan in the world, and based on the last video I made in the series, it's also not a plan that seems to work particularly well, but that said, I do like the sweater I wear when I make these videos, so I'm probably going to keep making them. Still, I am genuinely trying to grow my channel, so for today's popular topic, I have decided to pull out the big guns. Literally. Actually, no, that joke is going to feel super inappropriate in about 10 to 20 minutes, so forget I said it. Of all the popular topics on here that seem guaranteed to get people to click on your content, I feel like there's one that reigns supreme above all others, and that is true crime. Like, honestly, I feel like the only things that even come close are like talking about how much you hate Shane Dawson and boobs. Which, like, for the record, it's not the fact that he seems like a bad person that bugs me so much as the fact that he seems like he thinks he's a really good person. That's a topic for a different video, though, because today we're talking about true crime, because, well, honestly, I feel like if you can manage to make a decent enough true crime video, there's a solid chance that it's going to be the most popular thing you ever make on here. Like, I honestly feel like every channel I like on here, I found as the result of them doing a true crime video that drew me in, and then they weren't so annoying that I wasn't willing to stick around for more. Granted, being not annoying isn't exactly my strong suit, but I'm hoping that maybe there's a world where I can cast a wide enough net that I can reach enough people able to stomach me that there's still a chance that this plan might work. That said, though, there's a chance that I may be overestimating true crime's appeal here, because as you've probably guessed based on all the things I've just said, I personally am a huge fan of it. Like, honestly, I feel like my happy place is sitting on my couch with a cup of tea in my hand and my cat on my lap, and then just like a YouTube video on the TV where an atonal narrator is describing the most horrific acts imaginable over the spookiest stock footage that they could afford. I'm not even joking. This is how I unwind at the end of a long day. And when I tell people this, they usually respond in one of two ways. Either they get excited and say, "Oh my God, me too," or they get mildly horrified and ask me simply why. And honestly, it's a good question, because I feel like it's very hard to explain to someone who is not a fan of true crime what the appeal really is there. Like, for as much as I am making this video to try and grow my audience, I know in my heart that there is a very good chance that it might also alienate a lot of the audience I already have too. I feel like the large majority of you who found my channel through my recaps of America's Next Top Model did not sign up for discussions of murder and horror and stuff. And regardless of how much you might like my videos, if you're not on board for those subjects, odds are you're not going to love this episode. Although, truth told, I feel like a strong case could be made that Top Model is in fact a true crime. If we're being honest, nothing I talk about today is going to be that much more horrific than anything that happens on your standard episode of ANTM. But still, I get it. If true crime isn't for you, then it's really not for you. And I get why it would be really hard to understand why people like me would spend so much time treating the worst tragedies imaginable as a form of entertainment. Especially because I feel like a lot of the time, even the people like me don't really have a clear answer for that. Like, I spend a lot of time trying to figure out why I spend so much of my life consuming media about murder, and I'm not always entirely sure what the answer to that question is. My first thought is that it's because I'm a terrible person, because, well, if we're being honest, that's the answer to a lot of the whys in my life. But honestly, I don't actually think that's the case in this particular scenario. Don't get me wrong, I am a terrible person, but I don't think that that has anything to do with my love of true crime, because I don't think that liking true crime is a sign of some sort of moral failing. Like, based on what I've observed in my own life, true crime aficionados tend to be extremely kind, sensitive, and compassionate, and based on the amount of social actions and charitable fundraising that seems to stem from communities of them, they are also quite beneficial to society as well. Like, I'm not even joking. After FEMA and the Red Cross, I feel like the nation's greatest relief agency is probably just some group of white ladies who all became friends after listening to the same podcast about murder. But if a passion for the macabre isn't some massive vice, then what is it? What causes so many of us to be enthralled by these stories that on paper should really only make us depressed and horrified? When I sat down to write this video, I thought long and hard about those questions, and the answer I came up with was, I don't know. That said, I do have some theories. For starters, they're just interesting stories. Like, not for nothing, but when Shakespeare wanted to end one of his tragedies, he did not have his characters working out their differences over a nice cup of tea. A good narrative is all about building to the big conclusion, and you can't really get that much bigger than murder. So whether it's in real life or in some boring play that I pretended to read in high school, if things get to that point, it's bound to pique a lot of people's interests. Obviously, when it's a true crime, there's a human life attached, so that's not great, but that doesn't mean that a lot of us still won't be interested in knowing the deets, because, well, a good story is a good story. I also think that there's just a natural curiosity there. Like, just knowing that there are horrible things happening in the world around you is going to naturally make you want to know what those horrible things are. Even if you also know that you're probably not going to like whatever the answer is. It's kind of like when you know you have spoiled milk in your fridge and you know that it's going to smell bad, but you still sniff it anyway. Like, obviously none of us actually enjoy the smell of gross spoiled milk, but that doesn't mean you're not still weirdly compelled to get your nose in there. And honestly, if we're being honest, there is a weird kind of satisfaction from being able to say, like, okay, so that's what that smells like. Gross. Which actually brings me to my next theory about why someone might like true crime, which is that it honestly does allow a lot of us to confront some of our greatest fears. Like, I feel like things become a lot less scary when you're able to put an actual face to them. Especially when you're someone like me, who's very good at coming up with their own ideas for scary faces. In my experience, a lot of people who love true crime, myself very much included, also suffer from a great deal of anxiety. And while I feel like some might argue, like, of course you're going to be anxious if you spend all your free time watching people get murdered, I think that for me at least, the anxiety came first, and true crime is a way that I learned how to cope with it. For me, anxiety is all about my brain always going and going and going, trying to anticipate the worst possible scenarios it can. And like, if we're being honest, I feel like I made it through all of the legitimate concerns I should be worried about ages ago. And so in order for my brain to reach its daily quota of making me feel terrible, it needs to keep thinking up bigger, more outlandish scenarios. As you might imagine, that leads to some thinking that's, well, let's call it hard to manage. As your worries get bigger and bigger, they also stray further and further away from anything rooted in the real world. So to see horrific stuff play out in reality can honestly help ground your thoughts a little bit and remind you that maybe not all your anxieties are as big of a concern as they might feel like they are in your own brain. Like, I'm not proud of it, but I'd be lying if I said I never watched a true crime and thought, like, okay, so all that happened here is a guy stabbed his wife and buried her in the backyard, and they felt the need to talk about that. Okay, cool, maybe all the much more insane stuff I've been bracing for isn't actually all that likely to happen to me. Which, like, I also kind of think that's why I can relax to true crime, because, like, at least it's speaking to me in my language, if that makes sense. A big part of anxiety is that you're not always that present. So if I turn on something cheery and try to tune out, there's a good chance that the place I tune out to is going to be way more horrific than any serial killer documentary I might put on. When I put on true crime, then at least it's kind of like on my wavelength enough that it's kind of doing my worrying for me in a way that's weirdly nice. Think about it like this. If hypothetically you had a condition where you were compelled to constantly punch yourself in your testicles for hours on end, it would probably be a slightly nicer alternative if you could figure out a way to have a machine punch you in your testicles for hours on end instead, because your balls are still going to get pretty beat up either way, but at least with the machine you'd get to let your arm rest for a little bit. I feel like I probably need to work on my analogies going forward, but hopefully I did get my point across with that one, even if it wasn't the most eloquent way of doing it. And then on top of all the things I just said, there are also all sorts of personal reasons why people might be interested in true crime too. I doubt this is universal among true crime fans, but for me personally, a big reason that I'm into it is because in my own twisted, OCD-addled way, it does kind of make me feel weirdly safe. I know that this thinking is not rooted in any amount of reason, but I do feel on some level that if I'm watching a documentary about someone getting murdered, that means that I personally am a lot less likely to get murdered, because what are the chances that someone is going to get murdered while they're watching a documentary about murder? It's silly, but that sort of twisted logic is weirdly foundational to a lot of the ways my brain works. I know it's dumb, but there's part of me that can't help but imagine God as some screenwriter up in the sky doing his best to come up with all sorts of surprising twists and turns for my life. And so if I'm someone who is expecting murder, then when God gets to the point where he considers murdering my character, he's going to think for a moment and go nah, that's too on the nose. And in my defense, it does kinda make sense. 100% of the stuff I've seen about someone getting murdered begins with people saying she was so happy, or I never would have expected anything like this to happen to him. So because of that, I feel like if I'm miserable and expect everything, then statistically I'm probably in the clear. I know that this way of thinking has no actual basis in reality, but still I do feel weirdly safer making this stuff a big part of my life and bracing for all these terrible things to happen to me. In my own weird way, I feel like if I expect the worst, I will also prevent it, because I do feel on some level whatever the worst thing that happens to me in my life is, I'm not going to see it coming. And I just gave a whole bunch of answers as to why people might enjoy true crime that are all pretty different, so I feel like I should try to unify them in some ways so I can give one single clearer answer to the question, why true crime? Although if we're being honest, I'm not entirely sure that I'm going to be able to do that. It's kind of a hard thing to do. That said, I do have one theory that I've been knocking around the old skull box, but it's pretty weird, and I'm not entirely sure if it makes sense, so stick with me, I guess. But basically, I think that the ultimate reason that so many of us are drawn to these stories is that they're kind of like our own version of postmodern fairy tales. And hearing myself say the phrase postmodern fairy tale does remind me that I said that I wasn't going to ramble in the beginning of this video, and I have very clearly not kept that promise. So before I go into my grand unifying theory of true crime, I feel like I should take a moment to remind anyone who may not be charmed by my inability to edit myself that there are timestamps in the bottom of this video, and I will make sure to make it clear where the story you clicked in for begins. So Please keep watching this video in some way. I'm fragile and I can't take the rejection. For those of you who stuck around, thank you. Surprising. Hopefully whatever I'm about to say makes sense. There's a good chance that it won't, but that's part of the fun. I made a video a very long time ago about Little Red Riding Hood, which I think you guys should all watch right now. Not because it holds up, I don't know that it does, but I do still get ad revenue off of it, and it relates to what I'm talking about right now, so like, have at it. I'll link to it below if you're interested, based off that recommendation. If for some reason you don't feel like watching an old YouTube video from the Trump era made by someone who was clearly in the throes of depression, then screw you, but I'll give you the cliff notes anyway. Basically, the conclusion I drew back then is that when you strip away the fantastical elements of Little Red Riding Hood, it doesn't sound all that different from the kind of story that me and my fellow true crime aficionados might be fascinated by. A little girl walks through the woods unattended, and then shit goes down. Obviously, the real world doesn't have talking wolves in grandma drag because reality sucks ass, but the basic bones of the story are unfortunately not all that different from stuff that happens all the time. And that makes sense. Red Riding Hood, like a lot of fairy tales, is folklore. It's a story that was passed around for generations and generations, told and retold with little changes being made along the way until it became something big and whimsical that was sure to crush when you told it around a German campfire. There's a solid chance that if you could trace things far back enough, you'd find that Red Riding Hood was just some real girl who was actually kidnapped or eaten by wolves or something, and people were just telling her story because that was the juiciest thing to happen in their village since Olga cheated on her husband with Franz. So they told it and kept telling it until one day some snot-nosed punk in lederhosen was like, "Yawn, my sister was eaten by wolves too, that is not an interesting story." And so to make sure that that smug little asshole didn't have the last word, the person telling the story was like, "Oh yeah? Well, was the wolf who ate your sister also dressed up in drag? Because that's what happened to Little Red Riding Hood." So, and later that night, as his mother was spooning their nightly schnitzel onto his plate, the little boy was like, "Maza, you will never believe the story I heard today." And his mother was like, "Augustus, don't talk with your mouth full or you won't get any Black Forest cake later." And Augustus was like, "But Maza..." I feel like there's a chance I'm not being particularly respectful to German culture right now, but I do want to make sure that I convey my headcanon as accurately to you guys as I can, and in my head, this is exactly how it played out. That said, even in the unlikely scenario that things happen slightly differently than what I just described, I do still think it's pretty safe to say that Red Riding Hood and stories like it are rooted in our reality in some way. Even if there was never actually a Little Red Riding Hood, you can't deny that there is a kernel of truth at the core of the story, and that's what makes it so interesting to so many people. I feel like every time you try to answer the question, why is true crime popular these days, you inevitably get to the point where you say it's always been popular in some form or another. People have always wanted to know about the stuff lurking just underneath the surface of our society. Even if the answer isn't always pleasant, I think it's human nature to question what's happening in the world around us just outside of what we can see. I honestly feel like the only difference between true crime and folktales is that the stuff that inspired folktales was only preserved through word of mouth, and that allowed it to be added to and embellished and turned into something fantastical. And with true crime, you can't really do that. The further we progress as a society, the less able we are to pass around stories about grandma wolves without inevitably getting to the point where someone gives you the old "pics or it didn't happen." Granted, we're not so far that I think we couldn't still get a large portion of the population to accept the events of Little Red Riding Hood as absolute fact, but Well, that's a topic for a different video. And this may sound like I'm saying we live in a world without whimsy and wonder anymore, but I honestly don't think that's the case at all. I think the world is still full of wonder, I just think that the way we process wonder is different now. And well, that unfortunately brings me to that pretentious postmodern modifier I used to describe my fairy tale theory. I was an English major back in my college days, so there was a time when I was talking about the idea of postmodernism on a daily basis, but even then, I honestly don't think I really understood what it meant. Like, don't get me wrong, I was able to suss out when things were postmodern, but if you put a gun to my head and asked me to give you a definition of postmodernism, I'd probably just ask the gunman to tell my parents to get a refund on my tuition after they pulled the trigger. And truth told, I'm still not entirely sure that I fully understand it, but the closest I ever came to a definition came from my favorite professor in college, so shout out to Dr. Baker. Unless, of course, she doesn't want to be publicly associated with me, in which case shout out to Professor McGillicuddy, a fake person I just made up who taught my freshman year English class. Regardless of who said it, though, the definition as I understand it is basically that postmodernism is culture that has been built on an awareness of the culture that came before it. And like, there's a solid chance that I just worded that extremely wrong, so I will also give you the example that my professor gave me, because that was the thing that actually made it click for me, because, well, if we're being honest, I need most things explained to me like 80 times before I fully understand them. You guys know Godzilla, right? About yay high, giant lizard, friends with a moth. Well, if you do know Godzilla, then you probably know that he was a metaphor for nuclear war. The person who created him looked at the horrors that happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and he came up with Godzilla to better make sense of it. In the simplest of terms, he was basically saying that being nuked is like being attacked by a giant monster. And that metaphor worked. It made sense and caught on and became so ubiquitous that it drilled a hole into our collective consciousness and became a touchstone all on its own. Nowadays, if someone were to look upon a city that's been decimated by a nuclear weapon, they might even say something like, "It looks like Godzilla just attacked this place." Granted, it'd be super inappropriate, and Lord knows I hope we never get to a place where that statement would be warranted, but if we do, it's not that far out of the realm of possibility that someone might say something like that. And that, as I understand it, is the core of the postmodern mindset. Rather than understanding culture through the lens of the world, you understand the world through the lens of culture. I think. Like I said, I might be getting this very wrong because I'm trying to remember something that a professor told me many years ago, and well, let's be honest, I'm also just generally pretty dumb. So if for some reason my definition of postmodernism is different from yours, then please direct all angry comments you may have at Professor McGillicuddy. Truth told, I never really liked that guy anyway. The son of a bitch failed me. And honestly, even if that definition is wrong, it doesn't really matter, because really all you need to know for the purposes of this video is that that's the definition I'm using. When I say that true crime is postmodern fairy tales, I mean that they're fairy tales for people who are so intimately familiar with fairy tales and other stories that it's shaped the way they perceive the world on a fundamental level. Because ultimately, I do think that's what makes true crime true crime. It's anything that exists in that stranger than fiction sweet spot that people are going to look at and think like, wow, that sounds like something out of a movie or a book or a fairy tale or any other reality different from the one we all exist in now. I think this is why if I were to categorize my love of true crime, I'd put it in the same category as my love of paranormal shit and conspiracy theories, because aside from all being kinda spooky, the only thing that those things have in common is that they all expand the bounds of our reality and make you feel like there's a lot more to the world around you than what you're seeing. I also think that's why I'll eat up almost any piece of true crime in the form of podcasts or books or documentaries, but the idea of watching a dramatic film about stuff like this sounds deeply unpleasant to me and, frankly, bad. Don't get me wrong, I'm sure Zac Efron was great as Ted Bundy, but to see a dramatic recreation of how stuff like that actually played out only serves to make all that stuff feel real, and as far as I'm concerned, that kind of defeats the purpose. True crime is supposed to exist in our minds and feel like this unfathomable thing that shouldn't exist in the world that we know. Like I said, it seems like something out of a movie or a book or a fairy tale, and by seeming like something out of a movie or a book or a fairy tale, it makes the world we exist in feel that much more like a movie or a book or a fairy tale in a way that, while absolutely horrific, is also kind of cool. And before you go writing angry comments, I know I said earlier that part of the reason why I like true crime is that it grounds me in reality. And I know that that sounds very contradictory to everything I've just said in the past couple of minutes. But, I don't think that it is. I'm not entirely sure how to explain why that's the case, but in my head, it all makes perfect sense together. Look, I don't pretend to understand my own brain, but what I do know is that it cannot always be properly expressed in words. I spent a lot more time answering the question, why true crime, than I intended to, and I sat down to make this video, and I think that's because I was worried that if I gave the explanation I wanted to without explaining it enough, it might make me sound kind of evil. But the truth is, I think that the reason so many of us are drawn to true crime is because there's honestly something kind of magical about it. Granted, it's not a good kind of magical, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel the same sense of awe listening to stories about Jeffrey Dahmer or the Zodiac Killer that I felt as a kid listening to a fairy tale thinking wow, the wolf could talk! That was my impression of myself as a child. Although that said, I don't know why I made my voice higher, because I don't think that I technically ever went through puberty, so I probably just talked the same way back then as I do now. Although I probably sounded less tired. In any case, if my little theory is correct, then I think the easiest way to answer the question, why true crime, is to answer the question, why fairy tales? Because I think that the answer is the same for both, and it's this. We listen to these stories in order to learn a lesson. At the end of the day, the reason so many people spend so many years telling and retelling Little Red Riding Hood was to teach the lesson that maybe you shouldn't talk to strangers. And while I don't think that the lessons we learn from true crime are quite as clear-cut as the ones we learn from fairy tales, I do think that they're still in there if you look for them. Whether it's learning about the world around you or learning a lesson about yourself, true crime reveals certain truths about the reality we exist in. I mean, after all, it's got true right there in the name. So that's my episode. Please like and subscribe, and shit, I haven't even gotten to the main part of this video yet. Jesus Christ, why do I talk so much? This is gonna be a long one. Okay, so now that I've delved extremely deep into why I'm making this video, I guess it's time to explain what I'm making this video about. Hopefully that explanation won't be as long as the why, but truth told, there's a pretty complicated answer there too, so who knows? Everyone please just remember the timestamps. I hope I remember to make timestamps after I talk about them this much. But yeah, if we're being honest, choosing what I was going to talk about today was kind of difficult for me because, as with a lot of the subject matter I tackle on this show, I'm not entirely sure I should even be talking about this stuff. For as much as I love to sit down and consume these stories, actually taking one and claiming it as my own on some level feels like an entirely different beast. These are, after all, actual things that happen to actual people, and for me to insert myself into that narrative in literally any way feels extremely icky to me. Like, for as much as I support them and frequently help them pay their bills, I also genuinely believe that about 85% of people profiting off of true crime are the genuine scum of the earth. Mostly the straight men. There are some exceptions, obviously, but as a general rule of thumb, I don't think straight men should be allowed to make stuff about true crime. Fuck Mike Boudet. There have been many, many times in my life where I watched some overblown, overdramatic recreation that treated someone's death like a soap opera, and while I was absolutely riveted, I also judged whoever made it harsher than I have ever judged anyone in my life, and that's saying something because I'm an extremely judgmental person. It's mostly directed at myself, but still, it can be pretty harsh. As far as I'm concerned, if I don't handle the subject matter I'm talking about today in the proper way, then I run the risk of becoming no better than some schlocky television producer, and unless I'm getting the money that comes with that, that's not really a risk I'm willing to take. Still, I wasn't about to give up on my plan of making a true crime video because I do genuinely think that it has the potential to grow my numbers a bit, and truth told, I've sold my soul for much less than that in the past. That said, if I was going to follow through with my plan, I did want to stop and make extra sure that I did it in the least morally reprehensible way I could manage, which, honestly, now that I'm saying it out loud, I'm realizing that that's a big part of the process for most of these videos that I make. I should probably start thinking of easier subject matter to talk about, shouldn't I? Whatever, I'd probably just overcomplicate that too anyway. In any case, I decided that if I were going to do this right, I couldn't take someone else's story for myself. If I were going to proceed with my plan of making a video about true crime, the only way I could do it and feel good about myself would be to tell my own story as best as I could, and for that reason, I decided that I would talk about my hometown murder. For those of you who don't know, a hometown murder is a concept popularized by the podcast My Favorite Murder, although, truth told, odds are pretty good that most of you already do know, because I feel like asking someone if they know about My Favorite Murder in true crime circles is like going up to a music fan and being like, "Have you heard about this little band called the Beatles?" Still, on the off chance that you don't know, a hometown murder is basically a murder that happened when you were younger near where you grew up that kind of sparked your interest in true crime and stuff, and so I figured that would be perfect. So long as I was talking about my own experiences, then I figure that I don't really have to worry as much about not respecting the experiences of others. Problem solved. Unfortunately, though, solving that problem only created a whole mess of new problems for me to worry about, because I now have to figure out what my hometown murder actually is, and I'm not even entirely sure that I have one. Well, that's not true. I guess the case could be made that I actually have thousands, but I wasn't sure which, if any of those thousands were anything close to being something that I could consider mine. I grew up in Washington, D.C., which, along with being the nation's capital, also held the distinction of being the murder capital of the country for a large portion of my childhood. Like gun violence was so bad in D.C. when I was younger that they had to change the name of our basketball team from the Bullets to the Wizards because people thought the name the Bullets was too insensitive given the way that the city was, and if you want to know why that's extra funny, then just look up the name of our football team and know that we're just getting around to changing that one. That said, it's not exactly like I grew up on the mean streets. As you can probably tell, based on how visibly frail I am. I found this adorable little homicide map on the Washington Post's website. What you're looking at here is all of the murders that occurred in my fair city between the years of 2000 and 2011. And as you can see, we're pretty well covered. There's only one area where there's not a lot happening right here in this northwest corridor, and that right there is where I grew up. It's called Northwest DC. We're not a very creative city. I think it's safe to say that for me growing up, there were kind of two DCs in a way that's incredibly shitty, and I don't even really feel comfortable saying out loud, so instead, I will explain it to you this way. This map has a feature that lets you organize the statistics by the race of the victim, and when you ask it to show you the black victims, it looks like this. And then when you ask it to show you the white victims, it looks like this. Yeah. Yeah, my guess is that if you could do it based on the socioeconomic status of the victim, you could probably get fairly similar results. Back up you go. Oh dear. Let's just say this. Despite the fact that when I was growing up, DC was a majority black city, the neighborhood that I grew up in wasn't. The only black person I knew of who lived in my neighborhood lived in my house, and boy, did he have a tough time walking around without getting picked up by the cops. Like if you told me that there was a cop whose sole job was to just follow him around anytime he left his own home, I'd not only believe you, but I'd also say that that's probably not the most corrupt thing that the DCPD has ever done. To give you an idea of what my neighborhood was like, I'll tell you this story that my brother told me about a time when our neighbors' friends were house sitting for them, and somebody called the cops on the house sitters for the crime of sitting on a porch while not being white. A cop came, and when the house sitters explained the situation, he accepted it, apologized for bothering them, and left without incident. No, I'm totally joking. The cop kept being a dick to them for absolutely no reason. My brother saw what was going on and told my dad, who was a public defender in another life, and so he knew quite well how terrible situations like this could end up. He asked my brother for a leash and to remind him the house sitters' names, and then he pretended to walk our dog so he could go past our neighbor's house and loudly greet the poor guys to let the cop know that they were absolutely allowed to sit where they were sitting. Granted, the house sitters had already explained that to the cop, but odds were pretty good that the cop was more likely to believe an Irish dude in his 50s than a group of black dudes in their 20s. Unfortunately, the cop didn't seem to believe either of them, because despite the fact that two people had already confirmed it to him, the idea that black people were actually supposed to be in my neighborhood was so deeply unbelievable to that cop that he just started questioning my dad too. Eventually, the attorney part of my dad kicked in, and he basically stopped and said, look, either these guys are under arrest or they're not. So if they are, then I'm their lawyer and you can talk to me. And if they're not, then you're just harassing people in their own home and you should probably get off their property. The cop didn't really like that very much. Thankfully, he left, though, but he was so mad that my dad had gotten in the way of him being a dick to a bunch of innocent people that he apparently mumbled something to my dad about how he's going to remember this next time my family ever needed the help of the cops. So, hooray! The system works. But yeah, that's where I grew up, so well, that's obviously not great. I will say this. As the nation's capital, DC is kinda meant to be like a symbol for the country as a whole, and for that reason, it actually makes a lot of sense that it would be a place where a bunch of rich white people are living comfortably while completely separated from and oblivious to the shit happening to people right in their own backyard. Like, if anything, it's a little bit on the nose. That said, though, as one of those shitty, rich white people myself, it means that despite growing up in the murder capital of the country, I was mostly removed from all the homicides happening in my fair city. And, like, while I'm grateful for that in almost every way, for the purposes of this particular video, it does sort of complicate things for me a little bit. The only murder I can remember hearing about in my neighborhood happened about a block away from me when I was very young, but I had a lot of trouble finding any information about it, and if we're being honest, there's a solid chance that I made it up. Like, at the very least, I'm misremembering key details of it, because if I'm not, then it is very weird, and it does not make a lot of sense. The only concrete piece of information I can remember about it involved a word that I've since learned I'm not supposed to say, and since I'm pretty confident that there wasn't actually a gang of Romani people roaming the streets of residential Washington wreaking havoc, I don't really know what to do with it. I do remember hearing about it and being creeped out by it and having a very distinct image of what I thought the crime scene must have looked like in my young little head, but I don't really think that I'm ever going to have more information about it beyond what I already know, and frankly, that's not enough to make a video. Also, again, there's a solid chance that I made it up. It happened a very long time ago, and it's entirely possible I just misheard something that my mom said and became permanently scarred by it. Other than that, I had a pretty safe, comfortable upbringing. Like, granted, as an anxious person, I assumed that many people I knew and loved had been murdered many times during my childhood, but then they'd return my calls, and it would usually turn out that they were just in a movie. I had to call 911 exactly one time growing up, and that was just because I was walking my dog while home alone, and in the corner of my eye I saw a really creepy guy sitting on my porch staring at me in a really creepy manner. After I called 911, I also called my family friend to come help me, and when she got there and found me huddled in the corner of my kitchen, gripping the biggest knife I could find, she laughed louder than I have ever heard a person laugh, and informed me that the guy was just a harmless drunk dude who had passed out on one of our patio chairs, and the way he was slumped over just made him look really creepy because he was like this. And there was like shadow. It was really weird, but I was never in any danger. And like, obviously I did eventually figure out what my hometown murder was because, well, this video wouldn't exist if I hadn't. But the truth is, it took me a while to think of because I don't think of it as a true crime story so much as I think of it as like a period in my life. It's weird because what I'm about to talk about really only lasted for a little bit under a month, but believe me when I tell you that it felt and honestly still feels so much bigger to me. Like, truth told, if you were to ask me to tell you the story of my adolescence, it would probably involve a lot of the same events and players as the story I'm about to tell you now. So for those of you who skipped ahead on timestamps, welcome back, because here is where my story begins. Truth told, you guys didn't really miss that much. Thank you for not leaving me. Without any further ado, this is the story of the Beltway Sniper. Well, the story as I remember it anyway. As with all great stories, my story begins on September 11th, 2001. I was sitting in my 6th grade class doing my best not to daydream when my friend's older brother burst in and said that a plane had hit one of the World Trade Towers. My teacher sent him on his way and tried her best to get back to business as usual, but Before she could, the brother came back in and told us that a second plane had hit the other tower. Clearly whatever was happening wasn't just some horrible accident. It was an attack. A hush came over my normally noisy classroom. There was a tremble in my friend's brother's voice, and I could see fear slipping through in my teacher's eyes as she tried her best to hide it. Everyone in the room was kind of just looking around, trying to figure out how to react. And in that historic, earth-shattering moment, I just remember thinking, like, oh, the World Trade Center must be the Twin Towers. That's why there are two of them. That makes sense. Don't get me wrong, I could tell that something was up based solely on context clues, but I think I was still young enough that I didn't really have a good gauge of the difference between normal, everyday, scary news and historic, earth-shattering events that change everything. Like I certainly wasn't happy to hear that New York had been 9/11, but I had seen all sorts of bad stuff on the news, and in my anxious little brain, I kind of just assumed that sort of stuff was happening all the time. I saw how older, smarter people seemed to be reacting to the news and took their word for it that this was a big deal, but I don't think I necessarily would have come to that conclusion on my own. I talked before about how I always kind of struggle with anxiety, and at this stage in my life, I was already spending a large portion of my days bracing for the possibility of a nuclear bomb being dropped over my house and utterly annihilating me and everyone I loved in a flash of destructive light. Maybe I was just a selfish little asshole at the time, but compared to that, 2 buildings and 2 airplanes in a city I had only been to once when I was very young didn't seem like that big of a deal to me. It honestly wasn't until my friend's brother came back in a third time that things started to sink in for me, because that's when he told us that they had crashed a plane into the Pentagon. Unlike whatever the fuck the World Trade Centers were, I actually did know what the Pentagon was. I had seen it on a school trip. I had spotted its distinctive shape in the sea of buildings outside my airplane window as I returned home from trips visiting my cousins. I driven by it on the rare occasion my mom was willing to take me and my brothers to Five Guys on the weekends for dinner. Which, side note, obviously not the point of the video, but that was the original Five Guys back before they franchised it, so me and my brothers really had to work hard to convince my mom to drive us 40 minutes to get it. All of you people who grew up in a world where there's one on every corner, better be aware of your privilege, because we did not always have it so easy. Also, they apparently have milkshakes now, which, do you know what I would have given when I was younger? Wait, what was I talking about? Oh, right, 9/11. After the Pentagon was attacked, my 2 older brothers came to my classroom and picked me up, a fact which I was extremely grateful for, because otherwise I would have had to go and sit in our school's cramped little chapel, and I was always happy to avoid that place. Not on moral grounds, mind you, mostly because the seating was made out of wood and Mama needs a padded chair as much as possible. Now that I'm arguably an adult, I'm even more grateful for the fact that my brothers picked me up when they did, because as anyone who was conscious at the time knows, your "where were you during 9/11" story is to millennials what your "how did you meet" story is to married couples, and I'm happy that I don't have to spend the rest of my life saying that I went to my school's chapel and did whatever it is that they did in there. If I'm remembering correctly, I think that they sang hymns until their parents came to pick them up, which, now that I'm saying that out loud, actually does sound like a pretty good 9/11 story. That's a very funny way to react to a terrorist attack. Even still, I'm happy that the chapel is an integral part of my 9/11 story, because telling people that the school I went to had a chapel also lets people know that I went to a private school growing up, and I always feel very awkward about that. Whenever the topic comes up, it makes me feel very snooty in a way that I really, really don't like. Even though it's not like I really chose to go there. If anyone should feel snooty, it's my parents for wanting to give me and my brothers the best life that they could. They're the real assholes here. Don't get me wrong, I'm extremely grateful to have had the education that I did, but that said, I still feel the need to tiptoe around my school experience to this very day, because, best case scenario when someone finds out that you went to a private school growing up is that they start asking you a bunch of questions, and I genuinely hate that because, well, truth told, my school was very weird, and most questions just lead to more questions. I feel like the best way to describe my school was that it was kind of like Hogwarts, only instead of trying to train wizards, they were trying to train senators. Also, unlike Hogwarts, it was an only boys' school. Although that said, despite the heavy emphasis it put on the gender binary, the case could still be made that my school was considerably less transphobic than Hogwarts, all things considered. The older I get, the more I realize just how weird my school was. I'm pretty sure I was still in middle school the first time that I took an ethics class, and when I say ethics class, I don't mean how should you react when an older boy offers you a beer at a party kind of ethics. I mean, we were being made to read Aristotle and Kierkegaard and do our best to discuss it, even though I feel very confident in saying that none of us truly understood a single word that we were saying. In hindsight, it was actually very funny. It was basically just a room full of the most sheltered boys you have ever met in your life, saying shit like, well, actually, Kant would argue that abortion is wrong because if everyone did it, then there would be no more babies, and we'd say stuff like that, despite the fact that not one of us could point out a uterus in a lineup if you asked us to. I feel like if I took the class today, I would actually really enjoy it, but at that point in our lives, we were just too young and devoid of life experiences for anyone to expect us to even begin to grapple with ethics, and the reason that I know that we were too young is because we were a room full of boys, and not once did any of us giggle at the name Kant because we were all still too young to know why that's funny. Which is honestly a shame because I feel like if we did know why it was funny, we would probably have really enjoyed the class a lot more than we did. At least for me personally, I can say with certainty that everything went completely over my head because to this day, the only thing that I remember from that class is something called Laplace's Demon that I read in the back of one of my books. And by remember, I do not mean that I ever learned what it is. I just thought that the name was cool. So I spent most of the class tuning out whatever the teacher was talking about so that I could draw pictures of what I thought it might look like. So yeah, private school. Money well spent, Mom and Dad. Speaking of things that went over my head, an airplane had just crashed into the Pentagon, so my brothers picked me up from my 6th grade class and took me back to my mom's house, where my family and I spent hours glued to the television, watching the same pieces of footage on a loop, hoping in vain that they would eventually tell us something new. The gravity of the situation sunk in more and more with every replay of the planes hitting the towers. Like one thing I remember is that it was a genuinely beautiful day outside, and I think the fact that nobody was telling me to stop watching TV and go play is what made things feel really serious, because on top of being scary, it also just made everything feel like off, you know? Like I kind of felt like I was living inside of my own monkey's paw wish at that particular moment in time, if that makes sense. The more I stared at my family staring at the TV and saw that they were all genuinely a little scared, the more the anxious part of my own brain began to kick into gear, and it wasn't long before I went from not really getting what was going on and kind of just being happy to have gotten a half day from school to being so totally freaked out by everything that I basically started making the entire day about myself. The towers probably hadn't even fully collapsed before I started thinking about what might be coming next. My mind raced with a number of possibilities of what those first attacks might lead to, and I became increasingly more worked up with each passing mental image of my own fiery death, to the point that even my parents had to eventually be like, okay, Will, we get that it's 9/11 and everything, but chill. I don't know how I came to this conclusion exactly, but I soon became convinced that this was just the beginning. I loudly announced to my family with the sort of confidence that only a 12-year-old boy who didn't have a single clue what he was talking about could have, that this was just the first of what would become monthly attacks every 11th until our country had crumbled or we were all dead, whichever came first. And I guess my parents were probably just used to me at that point, but in hindsight, I have no idea how they handled that. I feel like if I were a parent on 9/11 and my kid had just made an oddly specific prediction about the decline of Western civilization, I'd not only be worried that whatever they said might come true, but I'd also be a little freaked out that they were possessed by a demonic entity of some sort. And I think that the only way that I personally would be able to deal with the stress of that would be to simply walk into the ocean. How my parents managed to make it through by simply giving me a perplexed look is beyond me. Thankfully for me and them and the rest of the country as a whole, I guess, I wasn't the skilled prophet of doom that I had pegged myself for on that day, because to the best of my knowledge, terrorist attacks never became a monthly nuisance in the United States. Unless you count mass shootings, but I don't know, those are really more of a domestic thing. Still, I was right about one thing. That was only the beginning. Exactly 1 week after 9/11 to the day, a new round of terrorism came to the DC area, literally delivered to our front doors in a neat little package. I tried doing some research to figure out a timeline for this one, but as those of you who have seen the show are already well aware, I'm not very good at research. Reading isn't really my strong suit. It's kind of like listening, but harder because there's not any noise. What I do know, though, is that on September 18th, 2001, someone started sending letters laced with anthrax to various senators and news outlets. And because they were addressed to senators, some of those letters ended up in the same city that I lived in, which, well, it wasn't really the energy that I needed in my life at that particular moment in time. Of all the things that happened during this period of my life, the anthrax attacks were by far the most manageable. Tainted letters didn't really seem like the biggest threat to me at that particular moment in my life because I was 12 and 90% of the people I knew already lived in my house, and that 10% is only because my parents were divorced. I think that the only mail I got at this point was the Toys R Us Christmas catalog, and that didn't usually get there until November, so I figured I would probably be fine, all things considered. Also, my mom told me early on that all I had to do if I got infected was take some penicillin and that would cure me. So, on the off chance that the letter writer did decide to hard pivot from lawmakers and the media and start targeting a random 12-year-old boy whose greatest claim to fame was being cast as Benjamin Banneker in his first grade play, I still figured I'd probably be fine. You guys should go look up who Benjamin Banneker was to see why that was funny. I've since learned that recovering from an anthrax attack is a little bit trickier than recovering from a bout of strep throat, and my mom was probably stretching the truth a little bit with that one to calm my nerves and not have to deal with the outcome of me adding biochemical warfare to the top of my already robust pile of anxieties, but because she loved me enough to lie, I was a lot less terrified by the anthrax attacks than I probably would have been under normal circumstances. Truth told, I feel like I probably would have forgotten about the attacks altogether by now had they not happened so quickly after 9/11. I kind of feel like anthrax was like the Johnny drama of terrorist attacks. On their own, they wouldn't garner a lot of attention, but because they came to the party with such a big, recognizable star, suddenly they seem a lot more important. I've never actually seen Entourage, so hopefully that analogy made sense. Still, just because it wasn't that bad doesn't mean that it wasn't bad. It was genuinely scary, and what's worse is that it was scary in ways that 9/11 wasn't. 9/11 was big and loud and flashy, but Anthrax was quiet. It could sneak up on you without you even noticing until it was too late, which... Well, I feel like 9/11 probably couldn't do that. Also, I'm sorry, I don't know why I just did jazz hands to talk about 9/11. That feels inappropriate. In a lot of ways, 9/11 was almost too much for me to try and comprehend. Like, I know that a lot of people died in those buildings and on those planes in ways more horrible than I will ever know, hopefully, but I feel like when I try to fathom the actual reality of what happened to all of them, I reach a mental block, and all I can really think of it as is plane makes building go boom. The Anthrax attacks didn't really affect that many people, all things considered, but I feel like because of that, the human element of it all was much more front and center. I have a vivid memory of watching the news one night, and they played a recording of a 911 call that a postman who accidentally handled a tainted letter made, and it was a lot. He was scared, he was wheezing, he clearly thought that he was going to die, and I, as a 12-year-old boy, did not really appreciate having to listen to that shit while I was just waiting for the 6 p.m. rerun of The Simpsons to start playing. What made things even worse was that Anthrax threatened us right in our own homes. It had only been a week since 9/11 made us feel like we'd only be safe if we shelled up in our bedroom and never left our house, and now we were being told that even if we did that, it still might not be enough. There was nowhere for us to hide anymore, which sucked for me because at that particular moment in time, hiding was honestly all I wanted to do. I remember watching my mom sort through our mail with rubber gloves and being fairly adamant that I don't go anywhere near it until she made sure it was safe, and it felt really weird to see because she wasn't the sort of person to do that. I had seen all sorts of media panics come and go, and she was never one to go along with them. I'm pretty sure the summer before all of this, there was a huge shark attack panic that was taking up most of the news' time, and I feel pretty confident that had I used that as a reason not to go swimming, my mom would probably have said something along the lines of, just keep an eye out for a fin and you'll be fine. This time was different, though. And even though I feel like the odds of me getting anthrax poisoning were about the same as the odds of me getting snacked on by a fish, the moment that plane hit that first tower, something changed, where now, regardless of how statistically impossible something might be, it suddenly felt possible. Are sharks fish? And really, I feel like that was the real impact of the anthrax attacks. Granted, people were also killed, so that was also an impact, but to the many, many more of us who lived through it, it was a sign that stuff like this could happen again. As bizarre and once-in-a-lifetime as that weird day in September might have felt, it didn't necessarily have to be a one-off, and that wasn't really a great thought to have. After a while, the anthrax attacks kind of just fizzled out, and we never conclusively figured out why they were happening or who was doing them. Although that said, their top suspect was this guy named Bruce Ivins, and if he was the guy responsible, which it kind of sounds like he was, there's a fact about him, which is my absolute favorite piece of morbid trivia in the whole wide world. Content warning, suicide. Apparently, when they were closing in on him as a suspect, he took his own life, and the way he did it was by swallowing an entire bottle of Tylenol. And obviously, I don't want to make light of suicide or anything, but I do find that fact very darkly humorous. This dude had access to anthrax. The fact that when it came time to take his own life, he resorted to using the most normcore drug imaginable is just very silly to me. Or like at least as silly as a suicide can be. Don't judge me. But yeah, even though it was probably Ivan's, there are still a bunch of people who would argue that we don't really know for sure. And that's kind of appropriate, because not really knowing for sure was kind of the whole vibe back then. It didn't take long before the rest of the country caught up to my way of thinking and started wondering what was next. And even though I was doing it before it was cool, I was not really all that happy to have everyone join me on my level. I was already good enough at coming up with insane things I should be terrified of. I didn't need the media and politicians and kids on my playground giving me help in that department, but unfortunately, they did so in spades. The way people talked back then, it wasn't a matter of if another attack would happen, but when, and that inevitability loomed over the whole country in a way that I think we still haven't fully recovered from, and probably never will. Pretty soon we started making changes to the world around us in a lot of ways, some of which made absolutely no sense, and others, well, looking back on it, it makes absolutely no sense that there was ever a world without them. At my school, we started practicing what were called Code Red situations, which were kind of like fire drills for miscellaneous terrorist threats. Basically, what would happen is that the school nurse would go from classroom to classroom saying, "We're in a Code Red situation," and then we were basically supposed to lock the door and cower in fear until things cleared up, because cowering in a locked room and waiting was pretty much our best line of defense at that particular moment in time. As terrifying as they were in concept, though, I actually rather enjoyed the Code Red drills. They took the not having to learn part of fire drills and got rid of the pesky walking and standing outside of it all. It was obviously a very weird sign of the times that they felt the need to implement that particular piece of protocol, but I figured that, like fire drills, I'd probably never experience a real one ever, so I kind of just sat back and enjoyed the opportunity to sleep at my desk. And as weird as it was, feeling like my 6th grade classroom might be a possible target for international terrorism, I get it. Everything was a threat back then, and everything that was actually a threat was treated like the greatest threat we've ever faced in the history of civilization. As you might imagine, that sort of stress led to all sorts of thinking that was... well, let's just say that there was a lot of confusion going on back then, and it wasn't long before people started exploiting this confusion in ways that really only made the confusion worse. When the government started saying that Iraq might have weapons of mass destruction, it wasn't hard to garner a shit ton of support for a war to fix that, because, we were all kind of just expecting something to explode at some point, so regardless of how flimsy the proof was, there were a lot of people who were ready to believe it. Which, I do feel like I should go on record as saying that I never personally supported the war in Iraq, but that was mostly because I was 12 and my parents didn't support it, so that was kind of the beginning and end of how I formed my political views at the time. If I was against the war, it's only because, as hard as it might be to believe nowadays, I had never actually experienced our country being at war at that point in my life, and so I didn't really have a concept of what it might entail. I think that part of me assumed that once the war in Iraq began, they were going to just be cannons firing outside my bedroom window and tanks roaming the streets as I made my way to school in the morning, and I did not want to have to deal with that shit. The Game Boy Advance was about to come out. I did not need anything happening to my local Best Buy. And while I'm happy that I had parents who were in the right, so 20 years later I can sit here feeling like I have the moral high ground, the truth is I'd be lying if I said I didn't get why people were so gung-ho about invading at that moment in time. I think we all have a fundamental need to feel secure in our own home. Home is where you reset. It's where you get to take a deep breath and collect yourself and feel calm away from the shit in the world around you. And if all that's threatened, of course you're not going to be able to think rationally. You're going to do whatever you can to get that sense of security back. At that moment in time, our home was being threatened, and so we did what we thought we had to do. And though I can't say this for sure because I didn't live anywhere else during this time, I do think that living in DC made that threat infinitely more palpable. I kind of feel like living in Washington, D.C. after 9/11 was Kind of like if someone had just declared war on New York baseball and I was Mr. Met. Like, maybe nothing was going to happen to me, but I did feel like a pretty obvious target, all things considered. My parents tried to quell my fears a little bit by talking about how we were probably the safest city in the world at that point. Like, the government was all there, and since they were the ones in charge of anything that might be keeping us safe, chances were pretty good they were going to use that to protect themselves, and so by extension, me. Still, the fact that my parents even felt the need to rationalize things like that to me at all made me think that, yeah, DC probably did have a little bit of a target on its back, and as it turns out, we did. I didn't know the date off the top of my head, but according to Google, it was October 3rd, 2002 when this all began. Or, like, at least when it all began for me. I was in 7th grade, and a lot had changed from a year ago when I was sitting in my homeroom being told about the planes hitting the towers. But, like, for one thing, I didn't even have a homeroom anymore. Like I said, my school was weird, so I'm not entirely sure if this is how it goes for everyone, but for us, you stopped having one main teacher and started living out of a locker and having to go from class to class on your own in the 7th grade. Although at my school we called it Form 1, because I don't fucking know. It sounds silly to say now, but at that moment in my life, this felt like a huge deal. Getting my own locker kind of felt as big to me then as getting my own apartment. Like, I had just officially become a teenager, and for the first time in my life I had a little bit of autonomy, small as it may be, so suffice to say, at that moment, I was starting to feel like a big man. Of course, then the mass shootings started, and I never felt more like a child in my life. Not having a homeroom meant that this time around, I didn't have someone come in and clearly announce all the information I needed to know like they did with 9/11. Instead, it came in bits and pieces from kids around the hallway, and once the rumor mill started, the only thing that I really knew for sure was that somebody somewhere had fired a gun, and everything else was kind of a question mark. Some people told me it was happening downtown, while others led me to believe that there was someone actively roaming the school grounds at that very moment. Some people said it was just some crazy person doing it, while others apparently had direct intel which confirmed that this was being perpetrated by Al-Qaeda. Depending on who you asked, there was anywhere between 0 and 60 confirmed deaths, and at that moment in time, I had no way of knowing who was telling the truth. After all, it's not like we had phones at that point. We had no way of confirming information, so news just kind of existed in this weird Schrodinger's cat-esque in-between state where anything could be true or not true, and it wasn't until our teacher or our parents came around and broke the wave function by telling us what we needed to know that we ever really knew what was what. And truth told, because of that, I didn't really give that much thought to what everyone was saying, because, well, truth told, this wasn't the first rumor about terrorism that had swept my schoolyard, and none of the other ones had come true, so I figured that no news was good news, and I shouldn't let myself get too worked up until an adult came around and told me otherwise. Unfortunately, that's exactly what happened. I was sitting in my English class tuning out while my teacher lectured us on To Kill a Mockingbird when my school nurse opened the door and told us that we were in a code red situation. Shit. Despite all the drills, I was not prepared for this crap. I didn't think about it when we were practicing, but code red situation is pretty vague. I knew it was something bad, but I didn't really get that much more in the way of information beyond that. And as it turns out, a locked room with nothing but confusion and a healthy dose of fear is the perfect breeding ground for my anxiety. I had no choice but to believe the worst of what I had heard in the hallway, and so in my head, there was currently a member of Al-Qaeda roaming our school grounds, and 60 of my classmates had been killed. As you might imagine, I didn't really take that in stride. I don't remember how anyone else reacted, or if my teacher tried to go back to business as usual, or honestly anything else that happened after the words code red situation were uttered. I basically just blacked out for a moment, and then stood up in tears, asking my teacher if I could call my mommy. Like, I don't know if you guys have ever been a 13-year-old at an all-boys school, but, well, generally speaking, you try to avoid that sort of behavior at all costs. My teacher let me do it, though, which was nice, and when I got in contact with her, my mom told me that she was fine and hadn't heard anything about a shooting, which was good, but it also meant that I still had no idea what was going on, so the call didn't really do that much to quell my fears like I was hoping it would. I hung up the phone and did my walk of shame back to my desk to finish out the code red, but thankfully I was still too terrified to be embarrassed. And if we're being honest, I don't really remember that much more about what happened during the rest of that first day. Like, obviously I survived and made it home somehow. I think we got a half day, although if we did, I'm not entirely sure because half days were kind of starting to lose their novelty at that point, and like, I don't know, maybe I had a sandwich? I'm not sure if I did or not, but odds were pretty good because I did like sandwiches a lot back then. Actually, I still do. They're really good. But yeah, that first day was kind of just a blur, and truth told, it's probably for the best. There's a solid chance that if I remembered more, I'd spend way too much time in this video obsessing over every last detail of that day, and, well, we still have a lot more days left of this stuff to talk about. As it turns out, a group of pubescent boys isn't the most reliable news source because I soon learned that most of what my classmates had told me was utter horseshit. 60 people had not been killed. It was 5. It was not on my campus or downtown. It was multiple locations throughout Montgomery County, Maryland, and perhaps most importantly, it was not a confirmed Al-Qaeda attack. We actually didn't know who was doing it, and wouldn't for quite some time. The spree was linked to another shooting that had happened the day before, so not only did we know that this person was still out there, but we also knew that they had struck before and would likely strike again. Other than that, we did not have a whole lot of information about who was doing this and why. The little we did know only served to make whoever it was seem more terrifying. The biggest detail we had was that each one of the victims had been killed by a single gunshot, meaning that whoever was doing this was very good at what they did. While I'm sure that little nugget of information was very helpful to the police in their investigation, I gotta tell ya, it did not prove particularly helpful to me personally. Obviously, a trained sniper on the loose is going to be creepy no matter how many times they have to fire their guns in order to kill their victims, but for me, there was just something about that one-shot detail that made everything way creepier. The way they talked about it, if I was ever unlucky enough to be caught in this guy's crosshairs, all he'd have to do was pull the trigger and he'd scurry off to his next victim and my life would be over and that would be that. And I wasn't the only person with that weird sense of existential doom. It hung over the entire area like a fog. But like, if fogs made you feel a weird combination of hopeless, terrified, and small. Which I guess some do if you get seasonal affective. It's weird to think about the fact that the next few weeks were spent on a tireless manhunt looking for whoever this guy was, because despite the fact that nobody could find him, he was kind of everywhere. Like, you know how they say that Manhattan was the 5th Sex and the City girl? It was kind of like that, but if Carrie, Miranda, and Charlotte were all scared shitless. I feel like Samantha probably would have handled the situation pretty well. Going outside during this time was weird because you could honestly feel on a physical level that something was going on. Like, I don't know if this is something that other people experience, but it kind of felt like a much less fun version of that thing that happens to me on Christmas sometimes, where there's like this weird buzz in the air, and you kind of know on some level that everyone around you is thinking the same thing as you. Although that said, the obvious difference between this and Christmas is that unlike on Christmas, none of us were looking forward to any surprises that might be coming our way. Simple activities like getting in the car or picking up your mail became huge feats of courage that required you to make peace with your own mortality in order to complete. Nobody in the city could go outside without thinking on some level that somewhere nearby, some unknown being was staring at you through the eye of a rifle, ready to pull the trigger and make the biggest decision of your life. To make matters worse, one of the other major pieces of information we had was that everything that this guy was doing seemed to be completely random. Despite how precise his shots were, who they were aimed at did not seem to follow any sort of discernible logic. He just kinda killed who he could when he could. As best as they could tell, that was kind of his mission. He wanted chaos. He wanted to kill anyone, anywhere, to let the rest of us who survived know that it didn't matter who we were or where we could be next. And if that was his mission accomplished. And yeah, outside of the fact that we were apparently dealing with some weird combination of Annie Oakley and the Joker, the only other bit of information they gave us was that whoever it was apparently driving around in a white van. And the second I found that little tidbit out, it started to feel like white vans were all around me. I feel like we've all had that thing happen where someone brings up like greyhounds or something, and then you see 12 greyhounds on your walk home, and a character on the TV show that you're watching goes to the racing track and there are greyhounds there, and then a greyhound bus drives by your house while you're getting your mail. Well, this was like that, only much higher stakes. They were everywhere. Some were painters, some were moving, some were probably just weirdos in vans, but there was a whole army of them roaming the streets of DC, and every damn one of them that crossed my path filled me with a very intense feeling of dread. When you're on high alert like that, there's a certain bit of animal instinct that kicks in that makes it so that you can feel a lot of emotional turmoil happen in the blink of an eye. We were told that a white van might be the thing that killed us, so when I saw a white van, the part of my body that wanted to survive kicked in, and it's really not a pleasant feeling when that happens. It would only last for a fraction of a second before whatever dwindling part was left of my rational brain took over, but it felt like an eternity. Every time a van drove by, I felt on some chemical level that this could be it. The worst thing that's ever going to happen to me might be happening right now, and there's nothing I can do about it. Then the van would drive away, and I'd take a couple deep breaths and try my best to rid myself of that shaky feeling and go about my day like normal. Which, here's the thing. I was a 13-year-old boy, so I probably should have been terrified of unmarked white vans, regardless of whether or not they contained a gunman. In all honesty, even during the height of the attacks, there were a lot of way more pressing issues that I probably should have been way more concerned over than the sniper, but those never even crossed my mind. As best as I can tell, there were 14 victims of the sniper in total, and according to some Googling I did, the population of the Washington metropolitan area in 2002 was 5,168,029. According to my calculations, which, based on my previous attempts at math, are probably wrong, this meant that I had about a 1 in 368,716 chance of falling victim to the Beltway sniper, which, logically, that doesn't really sound like that big of a concern, all things considered. But that said, this wasn't about logic. I feel like it was kind of like if I knew there were a lion roaming my streets nearby, I don't think I would give two shits if someone came up to me and was like, well, statistically, you're not very likely to be killed by a lion. I feel like I'd probably just close my door and wait inside and think, Jesus Christ, please don't let me get eaten by a lion today. This was terrorism, and terrorism is all about the illogical. Though buildings and people may be the ones who are attacked, the real target here is reason. The sniper was never trying to mow down every single Washingtonian one by one until there were none of us left. Their goal was the same as every terrorist, to make people feel unsafe in their own home and cause them to act in ways that they might not have had they felt a greater sense of security, and that's exactly what happened. For me, this mostly meant changes at school because, well, I was in 7th grade. My school life was basically my whole life. I didn't really have a whole lot of other things going on at the time. The biggest of these changes was that we were no longer allowed to play outside anymore, which honestly I was fine with. Like, we still got recesses, they just required us to stay inside of a classroom, and as far as I was concerned, that was an improvement. As long as we were getting time off from having to learn, the fresh air and exercise of it all was not really an essential part of the equation as far as I was concerned. Even better was the fact that our teachers' priorities seemed to have shifted a little bit. Like, at that point, the Game Boy Advance had been released, and so long as I didn't get murdered while I was on their watch, my teachers didn't seem to care if I played it during my break. Honestly, come to think of it, had it not been for the whole crazed gunman on the loose threatening to kill us all thing, this would probably have been my idea of paradise at the time. And then, just when you thought things couldn't get any sweeter, we also didn't have to do sports anymore. Normally, we'd have to spend an hour to an hour and a half at the end of the day exercising, and given that I was never what you would call capable of standing for long periods of time, I was happy to see this go. Instead, we now got to run out the clock at the end of the day with an extra period of study hall, meaning that I usually got all my homework done before I got home, leaving my evenings free for hours upon hours of television. Provided that the sniper didn't ruin things by committing another murder and triggering some breaking news that interrupted my episode of Will and Grace. Hell, if we were really lucky, they would even sometimes show us a movie. I remember watching the black and white version of To Kill a Mockingbird during this time to coincide with what we were reading in English class, and while it was a little old and boring for me to pay that much attention to, as far as I was concerned, any amount of screen time during school hours was an absolute win. Honestly, the only scary changes to my school day came during pickup time, because that shit was intense. Like, I'm not entirely sure what my school's walkie-talkie budget was at the time, but it must have been astronomical, because literally everyone over the age of 18 had one, and they were all constantly using them to talk back and forth to one another like they were the Secret Service, and every student at my school was the president. In order for us to leave school premises, our parent or guardian had to drive as close to the front door as was humanly possible and tell the teacher standing guard the name of the student they were there for. This would then trigger an extremely long chain reaction of walkie-talkie beeps and marking things down on clipboards that would eventually lead to the student in question, who would then be escorted to their car as quickly as possible by whatever teacher was on patrol. And obviously this system made a lot of sense at the time, and I get why there would be such an insane level of security when you're dealing with kids, but in retrospect, it is insane that this was just part of the job description for my teachers. Everything they were doing when they escorted us to our cars was rooted in the idea that we might soon be picked off by gunfire, which means that at that moment, as a part of their 9 to 5, my teachers were essentially volunteering themselves to be used as human shields, should the need arise, which, well, that's actually pretty insane when you stop to think about it. I don't know that there's a better system that they could have employed, necessarily, but I don't know, I just feel like we need to start paying our teachers more. And right now, some of you might be thinking that security is all well and good, but regardless of how cold and evil the sniper might have been, there's no way he would be so bad as to shoot at children on their way in and out of school. But, well, you'd be very wrong about that, because on October 7th, they did just that. 13-year-old Iran Brown was critically wounded as he got out of his aunt's car to go to school that day. Thankfully, his aunt was a nurse who was able to think quickly and get him to the hospital as soon as possible, saving his life, but from what I understand, his injuries required extensive physical therapy in order for him to learn how to walk again. And I think that this is the one that broke me. Not because the victim was a boy my age, meaning that any hope I might have still harbored that my youth would somehow make it so that I was off limits as a potential victim had effectively been dashed, because that might have made sense, but no, the reason that this one got under my skin was much, much stupider than that. When the police searched the crime scene, they found an interesting piece of evidence. The sniper had taken the death card out of a tarot deck, and in a faint blue ink at the top of it, they scrolled a message for all of us with our eyes glued to our TV screens to see. It said, "Call me God." I feel like if I were making a piece of true crime about the Beltway sniper, which I guess I am, but if I were better at it, then this would probably be the moment that I would spend the most amount of time focusing on, because, like, this is your money shot. It's that perfect true crime sweet spot that's gonna send a chill down your spine and make you say, hey, that sounds like something out of a movie. Granted, the movie that it sounds the most like is that stupid Snowman one with Michael Fassbender, but it's an interesting detail in the story nonetheless. I think that if I had come across this story when I was bored scrolling through streaming services, the tarot card would probably be the part that I was most interested in, because, like, when I say that true crime feels magical, this is what I'm talking about. Unfortunately, at that moment, I didn't have the security of time and a Netflix account separating me from the story I was watching unfold on my TV screen, so this didn't feel as juicy to me then. This wasn't a story at all. It was my life, and so nothing about it felt magical to me. It just felt real. And it sounds silly to say now, but right there and then, I was absolutely ready to believe that God was the one behind all of this. After all, the sniper felt powerful, like God. They had evaded capture in a way that was starting to feel supernatural, and they even managed to feel like they were everywhere around me all at once, just ready to smite me down in the blink of an eye without warning. Sounds like God to me. Truth told, after a year of terrorist attacks and poisoned letters and weapons of mass destruction and all the other doom aimed directly at the city that I called home, it was kind of starting to feel like God had me directly in his crosshairs. The idea that he would grab a rifle, hop in a van, and just start picking us all off one by one honestly didn't even feel like that much of a stretch to me at that point. It just kind of felt like he was cutting out the middleman. I remember the exact moment when I first saw a report about the tarot card, and I just remember feeling hopeless. I couldn't shake the feeling like maybe this was just the way things were going to be from here on out. Like, they were doing all right, all things considered, but that said, I didn't exactly feel confident in the Montgomery County Police Department's ability to track down and successfully subdue God. And that may sound like a bleak thought for a 13-year-old to have, but in all honesty, it's not even the most upsetting thing about my memories of the whole tarot card incident. In hindsight, the most upsetting thing is the fact that the first time I ever heard about that damn card, I was at my neighbor's wedding. News about the sniper was that pervasive. It was everywhere. Or at the very least, I was so consumed by news of the sniper that it was easy for me to sneak out of a hotel event hall and find updates when I was supposed to be on the dance floor showing off my skills at the Macarena. Still, whether or not I was the one seeking them out, updates about the most recent attacks were not particularly hard to come by back in those days. Charles Moose, the chief of the Montgomery County Police Department, became a local celebrity due to his constant press conferences about the attacks, which was weird because I don't really remember him ever having any updates beyond, like, another person got shot. Bummer. Like, genuinely the only tangible update to the case I can remember before they made an arrest was the tarot card, and I think that was actually leaked by the press against the wishes of the police department. Like, I remember seeing the card, but I think that's my brain revising history there, and really all we got was like a vague description of a clue on the news, and that alone was enough to drive me into an existential tailspin. Still, people watched those updates religiously, and I guess it was mostly out of hope. I think everyone was tuning in on the off chance that he'd just get up there and be like, "This is all over now. If you're watching this, then congratulations, you survived the sniper. There's going to be a pizza party in Silver Spring tomorrow to celebrate." And even though that announcement came a lot later, they still kept sending Moose up onto that podium to give us updates. And I think the reason that they did is because they didn't want to deal with the fallout of what happens when hope dies. I think they wanted us to feel like the people in charge were in control of the situation, because ultimately, I think that lack of control was the worst part of all of this. I mean, I guess I wasn't shot. So if that had happened, that probably would have been the worst part, but since it didn't, the worst part for me, and I think a lot of other people, was the lack of control thing. More than anything, I think people were just looking for a way to know for sure that they were safe. while the sniper was gallivanting around town, shooting at anyone who crossed the paths, all the rest of us could really do was sit around and hope we weren't next. And the idea that there wasn't anything more to be done was both terrifying and a little bit frustrating. Although that said, just because there wasn't much that could be done, that doesn't mean that people didn't still try to be proactive. This was the era of email chains, so I remember many, many lists going around about sniper safety that I'm sure were all totally bogus, but that didn't stop people from passing them around like they had all the answers. The only one of these survival tips I remember is that you were supposed to walk in a zigzag motion going from your car to your door, and that was supposed to make it harder for the guy to pick you off, which in hindsight is actually really funny. Like, while I guess it probably would be harder to snipe a moving target, I feel like the amount of zigging and zagging that anyone who got the idea out of their spam folder would be doing probably wouldn't make that big of a difference to someone as skilled as the Beltway sniper, who, lest you forget, at this point, as far as we knew, was probably God. Like, I definitely remember staggering my movements for a while until my parents told me I was being silly, and it's honestly strange that any part of me thought it was doing anything to keep me safe. Like, looking back, I do love the idea that some master sniper who had already taken out multiple victims with a single shot would see me zigzagging and be like, "Oh no, that chubby child is slowly moving back and forth. There's no way to shoot him anymore. Foiled again." As dumb as that sort of thinking seems now, though, it was a lot harder to recognize the absurdity when you're still in the moment and everything is still shrouded in a cloud of fear. If we're being honest, I'm sure you probably could have gotten people to do a lot crazier shit than zigzagging fairly easily, because at that point, people were just looking for anything to believe in, so long as it didn't involve them taking a bullet to the skull on their way to the grocery store. If I were to describe what it felt like being in the area during the sniper attacks, I think the word I would use would be exposed. The second you walked outside, you instantly became aware of every inch of your body and all the areas surrounding you and all the stuff that might happen to you, and as you tried to process all that information all at once, you'd realize you just couldn't do it. So then you'd just stand there doing your best to accept that you're powerless to change whatever might be coming your way, and try to put one foot in front of the other like normal, even though you don't feel normal. The only thing that you feel is exposed. And putting it like that, it does make it sound like this was all a lot for a 13-year-old to go through. And like, don't get me wrong, that whole year definitely did scar me emotionally in many, many ways, but like, so have a lot of things. The older I get, the more I feel like if I had to live through something like this, I'm glad it happened when I was younger, because I think that if it happened to me today, I would be infinitely worse at handling the situation. Literally, as I was writing this, there was a shooting not too far from my home in Brooklyn, and the only thing that got me through the day was actively blocking it out of my mind and trying not to think about it. Trying, of course, being the key word there. Because even as I tried to go about my day and tell myself that everything was probably fine, I could still feel it in there, in the back of my head and in the pit of my stomach. As I made myself walk around my neighborhood like normal, I had to actively fight in order to keep my anxieties at bay, because honestly, I feel like all it would have taken was one wrong thought in order to send me into a tailspin. It didn't help that when this all went down, I was working on this script in which I have just talked about how my interest in true crime makes me feel like I'm much less likely to be murdered, because by putting that thought into writing, I now feel like I have made the possibility of me getting murdered much more likely. I know that sounds dumb, but my brain is the one making the rules. All I do is let them consume my life. And yes, for those wondering, by saying that I'm more likely to be murdered because I said I wasn't likely to be murdered, I did just flip things back around and make it so that now I'm not very likely to be murdered anymore. Although that said, I may have just fucked myself over again by including this last part. I don't like my brain. So yeah, the mere fact that I was able to go to school every day when all this shit was happening makes me feel that it was definitely easier for me as a kid than it might have been as an adult, which honestly makes a lot of sense. at least back then, I had my parents to tell me that it would be okay, and I still had the ability to believe them. I feel like that's kind of the major perk of childhood. You get to have someone watching over you and feel safe in the knowledge that they got this. The older you get, though, the more you realize that as nice as it is, that safe feeling is mildly bullshit, because though you might have people doing everything they can to shelter you and protect you from harm, ultimately nobody is in complete control of anything, and nobody really knows what's going to happen. And the more aware of that you become, the more you learn to take things on your own shoulders and feel the weight that that awareness brings, and you do your best to accept that you're powerless to change whatever might be coming your way, and try to put one foot in front of the other and live your life as best as you can, knowing that all sorts of unexpected shit might be hiding out in places you can't see, just waiting to strike. If we're being honest, there's a solid chance that that exposed feeling I described a little while ago was just the feeling of being an adult. It just felt terrifying because I wasn't used to it yet, and so I didn't really know how to cope. Because even though I was getting my first little inklings of what it felt like, I was not an adult yet. For as afraid as I was to be shot dead in the street, I was equally afraid that the attacks would go on for so long that they might get in the way of me getting to go trick-or-treating that year. So clearly, at the very least, my priorities had not yet been fully formed. In my defense, it was probably the last chance I had to go trick-or-treating before I got too old, and so I was pretty gung-ho about wanting to go. I may have been terrified to leave my house, but I was more terrified of missing out on my last opportunity to get free candy before I grew up and was forced to spend my Halloweens hanging out at some dumbass party every year and just talking to a bunch of other olds who were also past their prime. For some reason, though, my mom seemed to have an objection to the thought of me walking around in plain sight while an active shooter was roaming the streets, and she told me repeatedly that unless the guy was caught, I wouldn't be going anywhere. And while that line of thinking makes a lot of sense to me now, at the time I was not willing to accept it without a fight. At one point, I think I even pitched the idea of me going as a hostage negotiator, so that way I could wear a bulletproof vest while I was walking around and I'd be protected from the sniper, but even in the face of such a genius idea, my mom still said no. I assume it's because procuring a bulletproof vest in a boy's husky on such short notice was not an easy thing to do. Amazon Prime really wasn't a thing yet back then. As it turns out, though, I had nothing to worry about because on October 24th, the police made an arrest in the case in a way that, given the fact that an entire city had spent the better part of a month trying to find this person, felt a little bit anticlimactic. Apparently, the sniper had made a call to a priest in which they alluded to another murder that they had committed in Alabama, and using that as a jumping-off point, the police were able to get a license plate number that they used to track down the sniper's car. Soon after they had that, they managed to locate the car they were looking for, a blue Chevy Caprice sedan located in a rest stop off of I-70. Two men, John Allen Muhammad and Boyd Malvo, were found sleeping inside of it, and at 3:30 a.m., after weeks of searching, the police took them into custody. It was finally over. I remember finding out that the police had made an arrest, and weirdly enough, my first thought was not relief. If we're being honest, I'm pretty sure my first thought was, where the fuck is the white van? Knowing what car these guys had been driving was literally the only thing we had to latch onto, and now we were learning that we hadn't even had that. I thought back on all the times I freaked out over the sight of a white van and felt like I had been robbed of a lot of emotional energy that probably could have been spent on some much worthier causes. And then, of course, I spent even more emotional energy feeling creeped out by the thought of all the blue sedans that probably crossed my path over the past few weeks that I didn't even notice. I think part of me was expecting it to be like the end of an episode of Scooby-Doo, where they unmask the monster and reveal someone you already know and then rattle off a list of motives and then suddenly everything falls into place and it all makes sense to you. Except for the reason why a bunch of teenagers were driving around in a van solving mysteries. I never fully understood that part. We never got anything like that, though. We had spent weeks trying to fathom this larger-than-life phantom who had been controlling our lives, and now we were being told that not only were there two of them, but they were just some dudes named John and Lee who had been sleeping in their van. It was so anticlimactic that it kind of felt like they must have made some sort of mistake, and we shouldn't even bother letting our guards down because the real guy was probably still out there, twirling his mustache and laughing maniacally because his plan to put it all on a patsy had worked out perfectly. After a few days, though, it slowly sunk in that yes, these were the guys responsible, and I was finally able to breathe a sigh of relief. But that said, it wasn't a good breath. The snipers may have finally been at bay, but all those anxieties that they kicked up were still swirling inside all of our minds. It felt less like the ending we were all hoping for and more like the beginning of some weird new normal that none of us had expected. And I think it's because I was so underwhelmed by the answer of who, what, where that I kind of lost interest in trying to figure out the why of it all. Maybe it's because it took a while for them to give us any answers, or maybe it's because I just checked out, but I gave up on trying to understand the motive pretty quickly, and instead decided to focus that energy on stuff that really mattered, like the upcoming release of Pokemon Sapphire, or the almost certain war that we were about to enter into with Iraq. It honestly wasn't until I wrote an essay about this stuff in college that I even bothered to try and understand the motives at play here, and many hours in the library and 1 B+ later, well, I still don't fully understand what the motives were, but here is what I do know. A lot of the explanations for everything the snipers did are very, I guess iffy would be the word that I would use. The thing I always think about when I'm trying to understand their motives is the Underpants Gnomes from South Park, where they have a 3-step plan, where step 1 was to steal underpants, and step 3 was profit, but step 2 is just this big question mark. I kind of understand what their plan was, and I think I understand what they were trying to achieve with the plan, but how one of those things was supposed to lead to the other is still very confusing to me. Still, confusing or not, one thing feels pretty certain to me, and that's that any plan being implemented was being spearheaded by John Allen Muhammad. He was 42 at the time and the de facto father of his then 17-year-old accomplice, so I feel pretty confident in saying that he was the mastermind here. It feels very unlikely to me that he went up to his adopted son and was like, I have an idea, and then the adopted son was like, I think I'm thinking the same thing as you, and then he was like, okay, say it on 3, and then they were like, 1, 2, 3, terrorist shooting spree of Washington, D.C. And scene. As best as I can tell, the reasons he had for doing what he did were a mix of him being an asshole, him having some legitimate gripes with systemic racism, and based on the amount of rambling that seems to be at play here, a healthy dose of mental illness as well. The police also seem to believe that a lot of what motivated him to embark on his killing spree was losing custody of his kids to his ex-wife. Apparently some believe that she was the intended target that Muhammad actually wanted to murder, and all the other killings were just build up to her. Not entirely sure I follow the logic of that one, but then again, I'm not a mass murderer, so as best as I can tell, all these factors kind of blended together to create a perfect storm of shit that spurred Muhammad to formulate a plan that was terrifying, insane, and if we're being honest, surprisingly well thought out. According to Malvo's courtroom testimonies, the Beltway attacks were phase 1 of a 3-phase plan that they thankfully never got to fully implement. Their goal for phase 1 was to go around the DC metropolitan area shooting 6 white people a day for 30 days, and though it all seemed pretty random, they had actually planned what they were going to do pretty meticulously before they actually did it. Apparently they had mapped out the best places to commit a shooting and even went to those places beforehand to practice so they would be intimately familiar with them when the time came to do their deeds. They had carved a hole in the trunk of their not white van, which they aimed their gun through in order to carry out their shootings without drawing attention to themselves, and mapped out their escape routes so they could get away undetected. As best I can tell, the only reason that they didn't reach their goal of 6 people a day is because they didn't account for traffic, which, well, that honestly might be the first nice thing anyone has ever had to say about DC traffic. After their 30 days was up, they were going to start phase 2, which would see them moving over to Baltimore, where they planned to shoot 1 pregnant woman and 1 cop, and then at the cop's funeral, they were going to set off explosives, killing even more police officers who might be in attendance. This would then lead seamlessly into Phase 3, in which they would parlay themselves blowing up a cop's funeral into extorting the government for $10 million somehow, and they would then take that money up to Canada. As you do. As they made their way up to the Great White North, Muhammad had planned on stopping at various orphanages along the way, where he would adopt as many black children as he could in order to train them into his own little army. This would then morph into his own, child soldier pyramid scheme, where he'd send the kids off to other major cities in the United States and have them carry out their own shooting sprees, and in doing so, I guess America was supposed to eventually crumble under the stress of it all. Little did he know, we have mass shootings all the time nowadays, even without his help, and we're doing just fine. As best as I can tell, Malvo was basically just there to help Muhammad implement his magnum opus. If I were to describe where he fit in to all of this, I'd put him much closer to one of Muhammad's hypothetical child soldiers than to Muhammad himself. I'll try to include all the sources I used to make this video in the box below, but I do want to call out an article called The Education of Boyd Malvo specifically, because it's where I'm getting most of the biographical information I'm about to give you, and I'm probably going to be doing a lot of that thing where you use just enough synonyms to make sure it doesn't count as plagiarism. So if you're interested in getting more information on the subject, I recommend you check it out. And yeah, like I said, Malvo was only 17 at the time, which seemed like a grown-up to me as a 14-year-old, but now as a year-old, it feels a lot closer to a baby than anything resembling a fully formed human. He was born in a bad part of Kingston, Jamaica, and from the sound of it, he did not have a very good childhood. I can't tell how much of this is confirmed and how much is just the stuff that we have to take Malvo's word for, but from what I've read, his father was mostly absent and his mother was abusive and also frequently absent, leaving Malvo with his neighbors for weeks at a time. At one point, Malvo was left abandoned for so long that the child was forced to rely on the income he'd earned from begging and selling scraps of metal he'd fish out of the trash in order to survive. Apparently, his mother had a habit of beating her son whenever he did anything she asked him to do wrong, and according to the psychologist who testified on Malvo's behalf, Malvo reacted to the abuse by teaching himself to be compliant, which, if true, would honestly explain a lot. Malvo first encountered John Allen Muhammad after he and his mother moved to Antigua. Malvo's mother became friends with the future mass murderer after he helped her get a hold of some counterfeit immigration documents to help her move to the United States. This led the way to Muhammad eventually striking up a friendship with the then 15-year-old Malvo, and the rest, as they say, was history. This again might be a little bit of speculation on my part, but to me it seems like from there Muhammad kind of just groomed him, and if that weren't sad enough, it sounds like Malvo was pretty easy to groom because Muhammad was the first person to ever show the poor kid any amount of kindness. Muhammad spent a lot of time with Malvo, playing basketball with him, providing him with a place to stay when he needed it, and educating him on the history of black oppression, and Malvo in turn clearly took a shine to Muhammad, learning to speak in a way that matched his mentor's American accent and eventually coming to call him father. The fact that he viewed him as a father figure worked out well, though, because when it came time for Malvo's mom to actually use those forged documents and move to Florida, she abandoned her son and left him in Muhammad's care. The two men then eventually followed her to the United States, where they lived together across the country at various homeless shelters before ultimately embarking on their crime spree. And since I already told you about that part earlier in the video, I probably won't go over it again because, well, this thing is already long enough. And yeah, that's the end of my story. If I'm sticking to my theory that this is all just one long postmodern fairy tale, then this is the part where I'm supposed to say, and they all lived happily ever after. Except for the victims who died. And John Allen Muhammad, who was put to death by the state of Virginia. If I do stick to that fairy tale theory, and I feel like I probably should, given that I spent a solid half an hour explaining it, then right here is when I'm supposed to ask, what's the lesson here? What truth about the world around us are we supposed to take away from this story? And truth told, I'm not entirely sure what it is, but I do feel like it's probably a lot more complicated than don't talk to strangers. The lessons in fairy tales are a lot easier to figure out because the stories they come from have the benefit of being told and retold for generations. They were streamlined and simplified and made obvious enough so that even little children could figure it out. So at the end of the day, there's very little ambiguity there. I feel like all you really need to do to figure out the moral of the story is figure out who the story is about and take it from there. Little Red Riding Hood is about Little Red Riding Hood, so the lesson we're supposed to learn is the same lesson that she learns over the course of the story. It's as simple as that. Unfortunately, in real life, it's not quite as simple. Figuring out the main character in real life is a lot more difficult because, well, real life doesn't have main characters. Or if it does, then we're literally all the main characters of our own life, which would mean that everyone on Earth is the main character, and, well, that doesn't really narrow things down very much, does it? When you're talking about true crime, I feel like the best thing you can do is to just try and figure out where to shift your focus. Even within the confines of a single story, there are always multiple stories to be told, and so you sometimes got to do your best to get to the core and try to figure out who it is who is closest to that central nugget of truth that you're looking for. And in a story so big and sweeping as that of the Beltway Sniper, that can honestly be pretty hard because, well, there are a lot of layers that you have to get to before you reach that core. Normally, when we're talking about true crime, I tend to believe that the victims are the ones we should be focusing on, and while I do think that's true here, I also don't really know if they're the main characters. The whole fucked up part of these crimes is that those people weren't really a part of the story until they were, and then whatever happened to them happened so quickly that it's kind of hard to derive any sort of discernible narrative from it. And if it's not the victims, then who is it? Who is the person whose name will be in the title when we're standing around a campfire years from now, telling the story because the robots have taken over and they don't like it when we use electricity? As you can probably tell if you've made it this far in the video, I've thought a lot about everything that happened all those years ago, and honestly, the person I keep coming back to the most is Boyd Malvo, because, well, if you're trying to find a fairy tale, then you can't do a lot better than a young boy who was enchanted by his evil stepfather and taken on a horrible journey. In the years since the attacks, Malvo has become a pretty controversial figure in a lot of ways, and people's thoughts about him tend to fall into one of two camps. On one hand, you have those who view him as a devil who held an entire city hostage for weeks on end, taking the lives of innocent victims and inflicting fear into the hearts of millions. And then on the other hand, you have those who view him as an innocent victim who was brainwashed into committing horrible acts by someone he trusted and is now being forced to rot in a jail cell for the rest of his life because of the actions of his abuser. And it's honestly kind of hard for me to say which side of this argument I land on, because from where I'm sitting, I feel like both sides are somehow equally true. Like, for the sake of transparency, I will say that I tend to side with the more sympathetic view of Malvo because, well, I feel like the rule of thumb should generally be that if there's ever a question about whether or not someone should be in prison, the answer is usually no, they shouldn't. Still, I feel like usually those questions are about whether or not the person in question actually committed the crime, but in Malvo's case, we know that he did. He did actually pull the trigger, and he did actually kill people, and he is actually the cause of untold amounts of heartbreak suffered by countless people who had their loved ones torn from their lives in the blink of an eye. I remember vividly the terror he inflicted on the world, and so while I don't necessarily agree, I get how someone might let that override any impulse they might have to feel sympathy. The debate about Malvo isn't about whether or not he committed his crimes, but rather whether or not his crimes were something he wanted to do or something he was coerced into. When he was sitting in that trunk with his eyes on some poor, random, unfortunate soul, was it ultimately his choice to pull the trigger? I honestly don't know, and I don't think that I ever really will. And that's why, though I generally do feel pretty bad for the guy and tend to think of him as a victim, I completely understand those who want to view him as a monster. Even if I might disagree, I don't think I would argue with someone too hard if they said that they thought Malvo deserved to be punished, because, I don't know, maybe he does. You can argue all the facts and all the figures you want, but at the end of the day, it's impossible to ever truly know what's inside another person's heart. This shit is extremely complicated, which is why I feel like the only people I'd ever argue with are the people who don't think that there's an argument to be had. I feel like oftentimes when discussing people like Malvo, you'll encounter people with a very black and white view of the morality of these situations, which basically boils down to the idea that murder equals bad. As far as these people are concerned, Malvo took his finger, which he controls, and then he put that finger on a gun, and then he pointed that gun at a person, and then he did this. And if he didn't want to do that, then he should have just put his hand in his pockets, and it's as simple as that. And controversial opinion here, but I also agree that murder equals bad, but even though that's the case, there's just something that rubs me the wrong way when people can hang their hats on such a simple argument and have that be the end of it. Like, I will be totally honest here and say that those people drive me absolutely nuts, because, like, how can you ever be so confident that anything is that simple? Out of curiosity, I recently looked up Laplace's demon, and as it turns out, it's very different from the cool monster I imagined when I was making doodles back in my 8th grade ethics class. In reality, it's a thought experiment, and what I thought was this was actually this, which is way less cool. Solid chance I'm wrong here, but as I understand it, Laplace's demon is this hypothetical being who was present at the moment of the Big Bang. And not only that, but it had knowledge of the direction and speed of every atom in the universe and an unlimited capacity for calculations. And what the thought experiment posits is that with all that knowledge and ability, Laplace's demon could have predicted everything that was ever going to happen in the future. I think it's pretty much just a much more mathematical, physics-based take on determinism. It basically argues that we are all subject to forces that came before us, and everything we do is basically just physics. The same way that a ball you threw isn't going to pause midair and suddenly make a hard left. Everything that we do is just atoms moving in the way that science dictated that they should, based on that one original explosion that created everything we know today. In this thought experiment, free will would kind of be like our own little oar that lets us paddle against the immense current of the forces driving the direction of the world around us. Which I guess in this metaphor would be a boat. If we do have agency, it would mean that the future couldn't have been predicted by some lame-ass math monster at the moment of creation, because in order to do that, it would need information about the choices we're going to make one day, and it couldn't have possibly had that because we wouldn't have made those choices yet. And in making this video, I've thought about that a lot. Are we just living in some generations-long atomic Rube Goldberg machine, or do we actually have some say in the direction that our lives take? I go back and forth on it a lot, and I honestly don't know. On one hand, it's hard to argue with physics. We really are just a bunch of chemicals, and chemicals react in measurable ways to the forces that act upon them, so it would make sense to me that everything they do, and by extension everything we do, is the result of some long chain reaction. On the other hand, though, it's hard for me not to believe that we do have choices, because, well, if we didn't, I don't know why I would have spent so much of my life agonizing over choices. Last night alone, I spent an hour in lots of emotional turmoil trying to decide what I should have for dinner, and I find it very hard to believe that me eating spoonfuls of peanut butter out of the jar while I watched old episodes of Boy Meets World was somehow written in the stars. And maybe I'm just being optimistic here, but I do think that I ultimately come down on the side of free will. I think we are granted the ability to make choices and steer the direction of our lives, and if you were to ask me if I think that Malvo made a choice when he pulled that trigger, and if I think he could have chosen not to do it, the simplest answer I could give you would be yes. Of course, if the length of this video is any indication, I'm not really good at keeping things simple. Because just because I believe in free will doesn't mean that all that stuff I said about us being a lot of chemicals reacting to different forces around us isn't still true. It's hard to argue that we are just the end result of a giant chain reaction of events that all started with this huge explosion that happened eons ago. And when you think about it that way, it really does start to make whatever free will we might have feel really small. If free will is actually like this oar you can use to steer your own ship, then I honestly feel like there's only so much you can do if you find yourself caught in a strong enough current. And if that's the case, then I think it's safe to say that some people's currents are a lot stronger than others. And is that me saying that I forgive Malvo for all the things that he's done? I don't know. I don't think that it is, but maybe. What I'm definitely saying, though, is that I cannot say for sure that I would have used my free will any better than he did if I had been in Malvo's situation. He, like everyone, was just looking for the basic safety of a home, and the only version of it he was able to find was warped beyond belief. He did what he could to stay with Muhammad because the life he had with him was his world, and he was willing to protect that world however he could. And does it fully make sense to me that that would lead to him picking up a rifle and going on a month-long killing spree? No, but in retrospect, neither did starting a war with Iraq because of 9/11, but back then, when we were still in the thick of things, it totally made sense. Which, not for nothing, but one of those things has a way higher body count than the other. If you've been made to feel enough fear and insecurity, you can be made to believe all sorts of crazy things. And maybe I'm wrong, but the sense that I get is that before he became the killer we know him as today, Boyd Malvo endured more fear and feelings of insecurity than I will ever know. Which again, I don't want anyone to take that as me completely letting Malvo off the hook for what he's done, because that is absolutely not the hill I want to die on. If any of his victims or their family or friends were to watch this video and respond with "fuck that dude, he deserves to rot in jail," believe me when I tell you that I would not be arguing with them on any level. I would say that they are absolutely right to want that, and then I would send them a basket of muffins to apologize for any pain that my video may have caused them. Still, just because I don't want to fully defend Malvo doesn't mean that I feel right fully condemning him either. I never had to deal with the things he dealt with. His life was scary and hard and complicated, while my life, for the most part, was safe and simple and easy. So for me to sit here and say I know exactly how he should have acted in situations I will never know feels just the slightest bit wrong to me. In all honesty, when I think about people like Malvo who have gone through more than I, with my privileged, sheltered life, will ever know, it's hard for me not to feel like I'm an 8th grader in an ethics class again, trying my best to argue about things that are way over my head because, given the life I've led, I don't really have the proper perspective on them. Making this video, I couldn't help but wonder how different Malvo would have been if he were in my shoes. If he had lived in my safe neighborhood and gone to my fancy school, if he had parents that cared for him and a bed that was always there waiting for him in the same place at the end of the day, if he never had anyone whispering in his ear and he was never made to pick up that gun, would he be different? I guess I can't say for sure, but I have to imagine that yeah, he would. And after I put him in my shoes, I can't help but put myself in his and wonder if life wasn't so easy for me and I was put in the shitty situations Malvo was, could someone come along and convince me to kill by tempting me with the possibility of a better life? I honestly don't know. I don't think so, but I don't think I can say no with 100% certainty. And I think that's what irks me so much about those people who talk about Malvo in such simplistic terms, because when you make things that simple, you end up ignoring complexities. And I genuinely believe by its very nature, the truth is complex. I think about all the time and all the distance traveled by all those atoms moving in all different directions that come together to create the moments of our lives and the choices that we make, and it feels really hard for me to accept that the truth of something so complicated could ever be properly summed up in just a few short words, even if those words are something as fundamental to our understanding of the world as murder is bad. Whether or not Malvo deserves to be locked up is one thing, but I feel like there are a lot of people out there who want to just view him as fundamentally evil, and that's something that I can't accept, because I genuinely believe that if evil does exist, it only exists because there are people out there viewing the world in terms of good and evil. Because ultimately I do think that more than anything, Malvo is a victim of circumstance. I think that there's a world where his home life is better, so his mother never moves them to Antigua, and he never meets John Allen Muhammad, and never picks up a gun, and never takes a life, and instead of sitting in his jail cell, he's living a normal life like the rest of us. When all you focus on is the very end of that chain of events, it makes you start to think that there are a lot of people out there who are just waking up one day and saying, like, I'm going to do something absolutely horrible for no reason at all. And while I'm sure maybe those people do exist, I think that they are very few and far between, and the much greater percentage of people who have committed terrible acts are just like Malvo. The circumstances of their life lead them down a bad path that, given a better set of circumstances, they probably wouldn't have taken. When the only response you can muster when you hear about shit like this is to cover your ears and go, la 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 la, murder is bad, then you abandon any hope of trying to understand the reasons that led to the murder. And if you do in fact believe that murder is bad, then you're probably not going to want to do that, because I think that the only way to prevent shit like this is to try and understand how it's caused. Because at the end of the day, I truly believe that everything happens for a reason, but I don't mean that in the feel-good Christian, God has a plan for us all sort of way that people usually say that everything happens for a reason, because, well, if God does have a plan, then he seems pretty disorganized. What I actually mean is that, well, everything happens for a reason. Nothing exists in a vacuum, and if you ever want to understand why something happened, there is always something in the past you can look to that explains it. I don't like the guy, and of everyone I've discussed today, he's the one whose grave I'd be most willing to dance on, but even John Allen Muhammad had his reasons for doing what he did. You look at his supposed plans and his history, and it feels very clear that he was, at least in part, trying in his own weird way to fight against institutionalized racism, and I'd be lying if I said that I didn't at least kind of understand why something like that would make someone want to pick up arms. I think about those guys on my neighbor's porch way back when, and how terrifying that must have been for them. I spent most of this video talking about how scary it was knowing that there was one guy with a gun out there roaming the streets who might randomly shoot me, but they had been raised their whole life dealing with a whole fleet of guys with guns out there roaming the streets who might randomly shoot them, and unlike the sniper, those guys were funded by the government. I'm very lucky to say that I can never possibly know what they were feeling at that moment, but I got to imagine that whatever I felt in 2002 anytime I saw a white van doesn't even begin to compare. And unfortunately, stories like that are all too common. People of color in this country are forced to deal with untold amounts of stress and fear that I and other white people will never understand. And though I feel like some people might disagree with me here, I feel like acknowledging that if racism wasn't so deeply ingrained in our culture, the Beltway attacks might not have happened is not the same as condoning everything that Muhammad did. And thinking about that, I can't help but think back to that chart of DC I showed you earlier, where homicide rates were literally mapped out along racial lines. And I can't show it to you again for obvious safety reasons, but believe me when I tell you that it was stark. Looking at something so dramatic makes you feel like there's gotta be a reason there, and while I'm sure there are a lot of assholes who are gonna just simplify and say, welp, guess that means that black people are born more likely to kill, I would like to hope that anyone watching this video knows that that's not actually what's going on there. In order to better understand what is going on there, I did a little research into why DC became the murder capital of the country when it was, and while I'm admittedly not amazing at doing research, just about everything I could find linked it to the crack epidemic of the 1980s. And while that answer makes a lot of sense, it does beg the question, what caused the crack epidemic in DC? And while the short answer is probably the CIA, the long answer is a little bit more complicated. Using my terrible research skills, I came to the conclusion that it was mostly due to a mass exodus of people from urban areas in the 1950s. This sudden exflux of people decimated the economy of these urban areas, causing extreme poverty for many of those who were left behind. Also, I know that exflux isn't actually a word, so nobody comment on it, but I'm going to keep saying it because it should be a word. The English language is stupid. The name given to the aforementioned exflux was white flight, and the reason it's called that is because the people doing the exfluxing were primarily white middle-class people who were so scared by the idea of desegregation that they essentially decided to flee to the suburbs. This laid the groundwork for what would eventually become the crack epidemic, as dealing drugs became one of the more viable career options for people in those decimated communities because drugs were one of the few things that the newly suburbanite white people were willing to bring their money into the city for. Also, I got to imagine that dealing with the stress of poverty is going to make someone way more likely to look for a release of some kind, so I imagine that also helped improve the market size too. And I can't stress this enough, but fuck all those 1950s racists and their little dogs too. Which I assume were all border collies, as that seemed to be the style at the time. Still, just because I think that they sucked and were doing bad things by jumping ship to the suburbs just because they were afraid to have a neighbor who looked different from them, that doesn't mean that I can sit here and say that I don't understand the impulse that drove them to do it on some level. At the end of the day, all any of us really want is to feel safe in our own home. I talked a lot about the idea of home today because the idea of home is an extremely powerful thing, but that said, I don't really know that I've ever stopped to think about what home really means. I guess because it's not something that you ever really need to put into words. It's just a feeling that all of us kind of know on some level. I feel like whenever we do talk about home, we usually talk about what it's not. We say shit like home is more than just the house you live in, or home is more than just some lines on a map. But when it comes time to saying what it actually is, I feel like we never actually get that many specifics. I think the closest we ever get is home is where the heart is, but when you stop to actually think about it, what the fuck does that even mean? It really does make you wonder what the hell it is we're all talking about when we talk about this thing that is so important to all of us. And spending this time thinking about a time when I felt like my home was under attack, I think I figured out my best guess at what exactly I think home really is. I talked about it earlier, but I think that we all had a time when we were younger when we got to have someone watching over us and feel safe in knowing that they got this. And really, I think home is as simple as that. It's the way you felt before you realized that you were exposed. Unfortunately, that feeling doesn't last. Some of us get to keep it a lot longer than others, but eventually everyone loses it. I honestly think that's why the idea of a hometown murder is so evocative to so many people, because for many of us, it was our first oh fuck moment where it really kicked in that, shit, maybe I'm not as safe as I thought I was. And once that feeling is gone, I feel like most of us spend the rest of our lives trying to get it back. I feel like everything we do in some form or another is just an effort to get as close to that feeling of home as possible, even though odds are we're never going to get as close to it as any of us truly want. And ironically, in that effort to feel secure and worry-free, we often end up making things much worse. We flee from neighborhoods and call the police and start wars, all because we're terrified that whatever final vestige of that feeling we managed to grab a hold of might slip through our fingers again and leave us feeling exposed. And in doing so, we usually just end up robbing other people of their own feeling of safety. It's hard not to look at all those murders on that map and feel like at least some of them were preventable. If people hadn't been denied the basic necessities that everyone deserves, they probably wouldn't have had to turn down some bad paths in order to get them. I know this makes me sound like the most obnoxious college freshman who just got his hands on a book about Marx for the first time, but inequality is, in its own way, a form of terrorism. It makes people feel unsafe in their own homes and causes them to act in ways that they might not have acted had they had the luxury of more security. It can be easy for some of us to forget sometimes that each one of those dots on that map is a story, and it's hard not to feel like under a different set of circumstances, each one of those stories could have been different. And whether we might want to accept it or not, I think the opposite is true as well. Under a different set of circumstances, there's a good chance that a lot of us could have wandered down similar terrible paths as the people on that map, and we're just lucky that we never have to know that side of ourselves. It might sound dumb to say, but that tarot card might have been on to something, because God really does feel like a sniper sometimes. He puts people in his crosshairs at random and makes them suffer just because they happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. If there's a fairy tale-like moral to be learned from Malvo's story, I think it's that things aren't always as simple as they seem in fairy tales. There are forces shaping this world that are way more powerful than good and evil, and I think the only way to fight those forces is to try and understand them as best as we can. It can be really easy to write off someone like Malvo as a monster, and maybe he is, but maybe there are more to monsters than we realize, and if we write them off completely, we'll never know. Like I said, fairy tales are simple and streamlined, and we know who the hero is, but maybe by only focusing on the hero, we end up ignoring the villains in a way that means we don't get the full story, and because of that, we end up learning the wrong lessons. Shit, I think this video might be trying to make the same point as Shrek. Empathy can be really messy sometimes. If you follow it long enough, it can lead you to places that maybe you don't want to be, and so it can be easy to sometimes reach your limit and resort to simple solutions. And as hard and as icky as it might feel, I think that we need to learn how to push past that if things are ever going to get better. Which, know that when I advocate for empathy, I'm not doing it in a hippy-dippy, love everyone sort of way, because I fully believe that you can empathize with somebody and still come away hating them and thinking that they're a piece of shit. More than anything, empathy is just a tool to help you better understand the world, and if you don't make full use of it, then I think your understanding of the world isn't as accurate as it could be. I've talked a lot today about how in a lot of ways true crime feels magical, but at the end of the day, it's really not. There's always real-world reasons that the things that happened, and hearing these stories is the only way we can understand what those reasons are. And by understanding how this stuff happens, maybe we can all use our collective free wills together to make choices that are stronger than the ones we're able to make alone, and maybe in doing so, we can make it so that one day, there are a lot less of these stories to tell. So yeah, that's my video. Sorry it was so long. It got a lot more complicated than I was expecting. Although I guess I probably should have expected it to get complicated. I was talking about murder. Hopefully my next video isn't quite as heavy, but we'll see. Tend to find a way of making things more complicated than they need to be. And yeah, like I said, the stuff that I talked about today was very complicated, so I'm sure I said some things that a lot of you disagree with. And if you do disagree, then feel free to let me know down below in the comments, and I'll do my best to read all the comments, and then hopefully maybe we can find some common ground. Although, that said, if you do comment, please be nice to me. Like I said, I'm very fragile. But yeah, other than that, like and subscribe and share and all that fun stuff. And if you've made it this far, it probably means you like true crime. So if you like true crime, then you should check out this podcast that I was on recently. It's called Brian and Eric Don't Belong Here, and it's all about spooky stuff. The episode I was on, I talked about Bigfoot, and it was fun, and I believe in Bigfoot now, so check it out. I'll post a link to it down below. And if you're in the mood for clicking links that I post, you should also check out princepeacock.com, which is a jewelry website that one of my viewers runs, and this isn't sponsored or anything, but they reached out, and I was like, these are cool, and I figured a lot of you guys watching would think that they're cool too, so I said I would pass the word along. So that's also somewhere down in the very crowded box down below. I'm gonna have a lot of a lot of links to post it when this video is over. But it's worth it. And if you've made it this far and for some reason you don't like true crime, then that might mean you like me. And if that's the case, then you should support me by liking and subscribing and sharing. I think I already said that part, but you can also support me by donating to my Patreon, which the link's down below, or buying my merch, because I have a lot of new options. Yeah! I have a t-shirt version of the striped sweater I wear when I do my top model videos. Yeah. I have a t-shirt version of the mayor sweater I wear when I talk about bad movies. Yeah. And of course, I have a t-shirt that says Content Warning 2006, like you'll see at the beginning of my top model videos. Yeah. Hell, you can even buy this shirt I designed when I was high one night and decided that I wanted my own name on a t-shirt. I don't know why you'd want to, but I get money off of it all the same. Yeah! So if any of those look like shirts that you would want to buy, then why not buy them? Because I'll make a little money off of it, and then you'll get a shirt that you like. Although, full disclosure, the striped one and the mayor one are kind of shiny. They had to be a different type of shirt in order to get those designs the way I wanted them, so they ended up a little bit shiny. So do with that information as you will. But the Content Warning 2006 one, I have absolutely no notes. It's great. Although it did kind of smell like vinegar when it first arrived. But I just put it on after I threw it through the wash, and it does not smell like vinegar anymore, though. So there's a solid chance I just talked myself out of, like, $30. I don't make that much money off of t-shirts, but it's some. Am I still talking? Anyway, this video has gone on for too long, so let's call it a day. See you later, Knitwits. Thanks for watching. Sincerely, Willie. Actually, no, welcome back, Knitwits. I spoke too soon because there is one more thing that I need to do. So please enjoy the name of my patrons while I pose for a thumbnail. Although, truth told, I don't really know how to pose for this thumbnail because it's murder. So anything I do will feel inappropriate. I feel like I should do whatever Kendall Rae does. So let's see how she handles these situations. Okay, so here is one where she's kind of like, that seems weird. I'm going to have the tarot card, I think. So she's going like, I guess the tarot card will be here. And then here's one where she's kind of rolling her eyes like, she's a very pretty woman, so I imagine that she can pull that off a lot better than I did. And then here's one where she's going like, oh. All of these feel inappropriate. I don't know how she pulls it off. Here's one where she's just kind of like, that definitely doesn't look good. Maybe I'll just do a very like, I think it's gonna say like a very scary year, so I should maybe not follow Kendall Rae and just do this like. Maybe just like, I feel like I always do that pose, and I've never used it once in the actual thumbnail. I think I should just be appropriate and just be like, that's not appropriate. I could just do like a normal like just like a stone face thing. Or I'll use one of the Kendall Ray shots, but yeah, that's the video. Thank you. Goodbye.